Most people, when they think about World War II, picture the dramatic parts, the bombs falling, the soldiers charging, the speeches and the battles and the turning points that changed everything. But here's something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Even in the middle of all that, people still made breakfast. They still walked to work. They still argued about small things, tended their gardens and put their children to bed at night. There were mostly ordinary days, and that's what tonight is about. Not the generals, not the battles, not the dates and the strategies. Tonight is about ordinary people who lived through the most extraordinary events of the modern world and found ways, day after day, to keep doing ordinary things. So get comfortable, let your breathing slow down, and let's just gently wander through some of these moments together. No rush, no drama, just the quiet, true, surprisingly beautiful story of ordinary life during an extraordinary time. Fact number 1. In the terraced houses of working-class Birmingham, Liverpool and Manchester, mornings during the war looked almost exactly the same as they had before it started. Families woke up at the same time. The kettle went on. Children were bundled into their clothes and sent off towards school with the usual mixture of love and mild chaos that school mornings have always involved. On the surface, nothing much had changed, but underneath, something had shifted. The woman standing at the stove waiting for the kettle to boil wasn't just making tea anymore. She was noticing, in a quiet and wordless way, that the kettle was there, that the water was running, that the house was still standing. There was a kind of low-level gratitude running through ordinary actions that hadn't been there before, a sense of these things being worth paying attention to because nothing was guaranteed anymore. Psychologists who later studied wartime civilian accounts kept finding this same pattern. The morning routine had taken on a weight it never used to carry. Each familiar gesture had become a little more vivid, a little more deliberate, because people now understood at some level that the continuation of these things wasn't something they could simply assume. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody was making speeches about it. The kettle boiled, the tea got made, the day began, but something small and real was being affirmed in that beginning, every single morning. Fact number 2. In occupied France between 1940 and 1944, the Sunday lunch somehow survived everything the war could throw at it. German soldiers were in the village squares. Husbands and sons had been taken away for labor service. Food was rationed and supplies were unpredictable. And yet French families kept gathering on Sunday afternoons and producing something, from whatever the week had managed to provide, that could be placed on the table with a little ceremony and shared together. What's interesting is that food historians who studied this period found that the effort put into Sunday lunch actually increased under occupation, as though the meal became more important precisely because it was harder to produce. People got creative with what they had. Foraged mushrooms, vegetables from hidden gardens, the occasional piece of meat from a neighbor's carefully concealed pig. The food itself was often quite modest, but the ritual around it stayed intact. The table was properly set, the best plates came out, everyone sat down together. And that was the point, really. It wasn't about the food. It was about saying quietly and without making a fuss about it that this is still who we are. You can take a great deal from us, but you cannot take Sunday lunch. Food historians and sociologists who studied French life under occupation have argued that this meal was one of the ways French families held on to their sense of dignity and cultural identity in conditions specifically designed to wear both of those things down. It was in its very quiet way an act of refusal. Fact number 3. The public libraries of Britain stayed open throughout the Blitz. Not just technically open, but genuinely, actively, fully functioning. If you look at the circulation figures from libraries in London, Coventry, Bristol and Plymouth during the heaviest bombing periods, you find something unexpected. More books were being borrowed, not fewer. More people were sitting in the reading rooms, not fewer. Librarians described something quite touching happening during raids. People sheltering in library basements would almost automatically reach for a book while they waited for the all clear. It was just what you did when you were in a library and had time on your hands, apparently even when bombs were falling outside. The buildings themselves had been damaged, windows blown out, ceilings cracked, parts of collections destroyed. But the staff kept coming in and running things as normally as they could from whatever portion of the building was still usable, cataloguing new books, processing returns, answering questions with the same careful attention they'd always brought to the job. And here's the detail that really stays with you. The books people were borrowing most during the Blitz weren't light escapist fiction. They were histories, serious literature, practical reference works. as if people reaching for a book in the middle of a bombardment weren't trying to escape what they were living through, but trying to understand it, or at least to have something solid and thoughtful alongside them while they waited. Fact number 4. Somewhere in the enormous machinery of the American war effort, somebody decided that every American soldier should be able to buy a Coca-Cola for 5 cents, no matter where in the world they happened to be serving. That somebody was the president of the Coca-Cola company, and he was absolutely serious about it. The company went to extraordinary lengths to make this happen. They sent 64 portable bottling plants to war zones around the world, cleverly labeling them as technical observers in official documents to keep them exempt from military regulations. The men who ran these plants became unofficially known as Coca-Cola colonels. From the outside, this might seem like a fairly amusing footnote, a soft drinks company turning itself inside out to deliver carbonated beverages to soldiers in jungles and deserts. But veterans who described that first cold Coke after weeks in a Pacific jungle or a North African desert consistently reached for language that went way beyond just being thirsty. The drink was a taste of home. It was the ordinary civilian world, compressed somehow into a single familiar experience. The pleasure it gave was entirely out of proportion to what a fizzy drink should rationally be able to provide. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? Sometimes what looks like a small silly thing is carrying something much bigger inside it. Fact number 5. By 1943 there were roughly 1.5 million allotments across Britain, and they had become something considerably more interesting than just vegetable plots. The government's Dig for Victory campaign had encouraged people to turn every available patch of ground into productive soil, and people had done exactly that. Flower beds in public parks, lawns at country houses, strips of grass along suburban roads, all of it dug up and planted. But what grew alongside the vegetables was something the campaign planners probably hadn't fully anticipated: a whole social world. The records from allotment associations during this period are full of it. The competitions over who had the best produce, the neighborly swapping of seeds and cuttings and growing tips passed over the fence, the informal morning gatherings of retired men comparing their brassicas with the kind of focused seriousness that the national crisis had somehow elevated rather than diminished. The allotment managed to be both useful and genuinely enjoyable at the same time. Working the soil, being outside, having a running project that rewarded steady attention, being part of a little community of people with mud on their hands. All of those things fed something in people that had nothing to do with vegetables and everything to do with what it means to feel like yourself during a time when a lot of other things are trying to make you feel like a smaller version of yourself. Fact number 6. In Japan, the tradition of hanami, gathering with family or friends beneath the cherry trees when they bloom in spring, continued throughout the war years, but it had taken on a complexity that it hadn't carried before. The militarist government had done something a little troubling with the cherry blossom. They'd turned it into a symbol of the soldier dying young, and gloriously the beautiful brief life in service of the emperor. The official meaning of the blossoms had been draped in military clothing. But families sitting beneath those trees in the springs of 1942, 1943, and 1944 were experiencing something older and quieter than that official version. The diaries and letters from this period describe people gathering with an acute awareness of the empty spaces in the circle, the sons who weren't there, the brothers who had gone, and alongside that awareness, a heightened noticing of the beauty itself. The blossoms, which had always been beautiful, somehow meant more now. The spring kept arriving, the trees kept flowering, and ordinary Japanese families kept gathering beneath them, not to celebrate martial glory, but to do what humans have always done under those trees: sit together, notice something beautiful, and feel the complicated mixture of gratitude and sadness that beauty produces when the world around it is in difficulty. It was one of the ways life insisted on its own continuity. Fact number 7. When the British government closed all cinemas and theatres in September 1939, they did it as a precaution. What they hadn't fully anticipated was how quickly it would become clear that this was a terrible idea. Within weeks, it was obvious that civilian morale needed the cinema. The closures were reversed, and from that point on, British cinemas stayed open essentially for the entire war, including during raids. If you were watching a film and the sirens went off, a notice would appear on the screen telling you an alert was in effect, but the film kept running. You could stay or go. Most people stayed. The numbers tell you everything about how much people needed this. Annual cinema admissions in Britain rose from around 990 million in 1939 to 1.64 billion in 1945. That's the highest annual figure in the entire history of British cinema, right in the middle of the war. Veterans and civilians who talked about wartime cinema in later years almost never led with the specific films they'd seen. What they remembered was the experience itself. The warmth of the dark room, the way a whole audience laughed together, the feeling of the outside world being on pause for a couple of hours. It wasn't escapism in any shallow sense. It was a place where the emotional life of the country, the humor and the sentiment and the longing and the occasional genuine joy could be felt together in a room full of strangers. Fact number 8. In the Soviet Union, people played chess throughout the war. This on its own sounds unremarkable. People play chess all the time. But when you look at where and when they were playing it, the picture becomes something quite remarkable. Chess had been a state-promoted leisure activity in the Soviet Union since the 1920s, deeply embedded in everyday culture. Factory workers played on their breaks, soldiers played between engagements, and civilians in besieged Leningrad, where by the winter of 1941 to 1942 the daily bread ration for non-working adults had fallen to 125 grams and the temperature was well below freezing, continued to play organized competitive chess in apartments they were barely able to heat. The chess records from the Leningrad siege survive. Tournament results, game scores, club membership records. They show that organized competitive chess kept going in the city throughout the entire 872-day siege. It wasn't distraction exactly. Chess demands too much focused attention to be passive escape. What it seems to have provided was something closer to proof. Proof that the mind was still working, that you were still capable of concentrated, creative, disciplined thought, that you were still in every meaningful sense present. To sit down and play a game of chess in Leningrad in that winter was to say something about who you still were, in conditions that were trying very hard to reduce you to simply surviving. Fact number 9. The British school day during the war was, to put it mildly, not conducted under ideal circumstances. Schools were evacuated and then relocated. Buildings were bombed and then reopened in church halls, private homes, and whatever parts of the original structure were still usable. Teachers followed their pupils into the countryside and set up classrooms in village halls. Science experiments were conducted with whatever materials were available. Latin was taught in farmers' barns. Handwriting was practiced in cold vestries. And yet school inspection records from this period describe levels of academic achievement that genuinely surprised people. Children learning, adapting, keeping up with their work in conditions that had nothing in common with normal schooling. There's something worth sitting with in that. The institution of the school day, its routines and structures and expectations, acted as a container for normality inside all the disruption. The lesson being delivered wasn't only whatever happened to be on the timetable. There was a larger lesson being taught just by the act of showing up, of a teacher standing at the front of a room and proceeding as though learning mattered, as though tomorrow was still worth preparing for, as though the ordinary world with its requirements and its small disciplines was worth maintaining. Both the teachers and the children seemed to understand this, even if they couldn't have put it into words. Fact number 10. Even during the war, people found ways to play sport, and the way they did it tells you something interesting about what sport is actually for. County cricket was formally suspended in Britain for the duration, but informal cricket kept happening, on village greens, in army camps, in prisoner of war camps on the other side of the world. Association football reorganized itself on regional lines and kept going. In Germany, the Gauliga competition continued until 1944. Japanese sumo tournaments ran until 1944. In occupied Paris, French football drew substantial crowds that the German authorities permitted and occasionally attended. Across all these different places and cultures, sport persisted. And when you look at why, it's not really about the specific games, it's about what the games created around themselves. A space where ordinary competitive pleasure could happen, where physical energy could be channeled, where people could get genuinely enthusiastic about something that had no military significance whatsoever. Sport was a space that existed outside the war's logic. You didn't watch it because it would help anything, or because it was useful, or because it would bring the end any closer. You watched it because you wanted to, because the team you supported was playing and you cared how they got on. That kind of caring, simple and selfish and completely human, was itself a form of proof that ordinary life was still intact. Fact number 11. The radio changed what it meant to be home during the war in a way that nothing before or since has quite managed to replicate. Before the war, a radio was a useful piece of furniture. During the war, it became something closer to a family member. In Britain and America, in Germany and Japan, and across occupied Europe where listening to foreign broadcasts could land you in prison, households arranged their evenings around the radio in a way that had a regularity almost like breathing. The BBC alone broadcast the 9 o'clock news, morning variety programs, lunchtime shows, evening entertainment, cooking advice under rationing, concerts, comedy, drama, speeches. Something was always on, and at certain hours the whole country was listening to the same thing simultaneously. That simultaneity was the remarkable part. The individual family in their particular house, in their particular street, knew that millions of other families were in their own houses, their own streets, listening to the same voice at the same moment. It created a thread of connection across all the distances the war had opened up. Families separated by evacuation and military service and working relocations could listen to the same program and know the other person was listening too. It wasn't physical closeness, but it was something. It was a way of being together when being together wasn't possible. Fact number 12. During the Second World War, people wrote letters at a scale and with an intensity that is genuinely hard to imagine today. In Britain alone, the post office handled hundreds of millions more items annually than it had before the war. Every separation the war created, and it created an enormous number of them, produced a corresponding flow of letters trying to bridge the gap. What's striking about these letters, which survive in archives all over the world, is how ordinary their content usually was. Soldiers writing home described the food, the weather, a joke someone in the unit had told. Mothers wrote about the garden, what the neighbors had been up to, a small repair that needed doing around the house. Almost none of the big feelings, almost none of the fear. This wasn't accidental, it was a deliberate strategy, though probably not a consciously thought out one. Both sides of the correspondence had silently agreed to use ordinary details as the building material for the bridge, not because the big feelings weren't there. They were there, enormous and unspoken, but because talking about the garden was a way of saying, the world we shared still exists. I still know what your life looks like. We are still connected to the same ordinary things. The letter was a daily act of love built entirely from small, familiar bricks. Fact number 13. The American drugstore soda fountain is not something that features prominently in most accounts of the Second World War. But for anyone thinking about what ordinary civilian life looked like during those years, it probably should. The soda fountain, with its ice cream and milkshakes and sandwiches and counter stools and the cheerful informality of the whole setup, wasn't rationed. It wasn't restricted. It kept operating throughout the war, accessible to most people, unchanged in the ways that mattered. Teenagers gathered there after school, same as always. Women on their lunch breaks from defense factories stopped in for something to eat. Older men sat at the counter with their newspapers, in no particular hurry. The social rituals around the soda fountain continued without interruption, which meant the soda fountain quietly became one of the more reliable sources of something social historians have called ordinary sociability. The low-key, comfortable, face-to-face human interaction that keeps the texture of community life feeling real. The war had made a great many things uncertain. The soda fountain had not changed. The ice cream was the same ice cream. And that sameness, that dependable availability of something pleasant and unchanged, was worth considerably more than its price would suggest. Fact number 14. After the initial panic of September 1939, when an estimated 750,000 British cats and dogs were put down in the space of a few days by owners terrified of what was coming, something interesting happened. The British people who still had pets simply continued to have them and to treat their well-being as a non-negotiable part of how the household functioned. Rations were shared with animals in ways the official ration system hadn't really planned for. Workarounds were found. And historians who've looked closely at this have found that the animals served a specific emotional function that people often didn't articulate but clearly understood. The pet was one of the few relationships in a wartime life that asked for nothing complicated. It didn't need reassuring. It wasn't frightened or grieving or managing difficult news. It was just there, consistent, warm, responding to you with the simple, uncomplicated pleasure of an animal in the presence of its person. In a world where most human relationships had become weighted with anxiety and loss and things left unsaid, that simplicity was genuinely restorative, and walking the dog got you outside, into a specific street on a specific morning with specific sounds and smells and a quality of light that belonged only to that moment. That kind of grounding in the immediate physical present was harder to achieve than it sounds, in a time when your mind was constantly being pulled toward things you couldn't see or know or control. Fact number 15. Across Germany during the war years, people kept having their afternoon coffee and cake, and this is more interesting than it sounds. By the middle years of the war, the coffee in German cups was usually an ersatz substitute made from roasted grain, chicory and acorn, something that resembled real coffee mainly in that it was a hot liquid. The cakes had become simpler and drier as rationing tightened, made with ingredients that pre-war bakers would have found puzzling. Nobody was pretending the situation was good, and yet the ritual continued. At the appropriate hour, the table was set, the cups were arranged. The cake, however modest, was put out with the ceremony its occasion called for. People sat down together and marked the afternoon in the way that the afternoon had always been marked. Social historians have noted that this wasn't denial, it was something more considered, an insistence that the cultural rhythms of ordinary German domestic life still meant something, regardless of what the war was doing to the materials that supported them. The gathering mattered more than what was served. The hour set aside for sitting together mattered more than the quality of the coffee. It was a form of preservation, of saying that who we are is not entirely dependent on what we currently have access to. Fact number 16. Alongside all the vegetable growing that the war had made both necessary and patriotic, something quieter was also happening in gardens across Britain, the United States, and occupied Europe. People were still growing flowers, not on a large scale, and not in ways that attracted official attention or commendation, but roses were being tended in gardens within earshot of anti-aircraft guns. Window boxes were being maintained on the upper floors of partially bombed buildings. Herbaceous borders were kept up with the seasonal patient attention that gardening requires and rewards, a rhythm that had nothing to do with the war's rhythm and ran on entirely its own schedule. Gardeners who wrote about their wartime practice consistently described something emotional in it beyond the horticulture itself, a sense of relationship with the growing season, a feeling of natural order and continuity that the war was constantly disrupting but couldn't entirely break. The dahlia didn't know there was a war. The garden required the same things of you it had always required: steady attention, care, responsiveness to what was actually happening in the soil rather than what you wished was happening. Each time a gardener went back to the garden, it was a small act of faith in the future, not a grand gesture, just the ordinary gesture of someone who intends to be around to see what comes up next season. Fact number 17. Here's something that might seem trivial but isn't. Throughout the war, people kept getting their hair cut, not because anyone told them to, not as a morale initiative or an official program, just because people do get their hair cut, and wartime civilians continued to do so even as other personal expenditures shrank. The barbershop was a place of easy, low-stakes male conversation. Sport, weather, the war, the particular humor of people who see each other regularly and have developed an understood shorthand. Nothing was required of you there except to sit in the chair and be reasonably agreeable. The hairdressing salon served a similar function for women, a space for social exchange, for the rituals of personal presentation, for the specific kind of conversation that happens when one person is doing something physical for another person and the relationship is relaxed and regular. British women's magazines during the war years ran a somewhat official line that maintaining personal appearance was itself a form of patriotism, a contribution to collective morale. Whether or not anyone found that argument particularly persuasive, the behavior it was describing was already happening. Women kept having their hair done with the cosmetics that were available. They kept attending to the ordinary rituals of looking like themselves, because whatever else had changed, the person in the mirror was still there, and that person deserved the same care and attention they'd always received. Fact number 18. While battles were being fought in the desert a few hundred miles to the west, the markets of wartime Cairo carried on in essentially their normal fashion, which is to say busy, chaotic, ancient, and entirely absorbed in the business of commerce. The Khan el-Khalili Bazaar and the streets around it continued to operate with the organic energy of a trading space that had been functioning for centuries and had seen enough dramatic situations to accommodate this one as simply another set of conditions to trade around. British, Australian, New Zealand, South African, Indian and Free French soldiers passed through on their leave periods. They bought things. Egyptian merchants adapted their offerings to this new and culturally varied clientele with the practical intelligence of people who'd been dealing with outsiders for a very long time. What strikes you about this if you sit with it is the straightforward human normality of it. Young men far from home in a city they'd never seen before, wandering through a market, looking at things, buying small objects to send home or to keep. And on the other side of the transaction, merchants doing what merchants do, reading their customers, adjusting their approach, making a living. The desert war was enormous and consequential. The market was ancient and indifferent to it, and continued to be a market, and in doing so provided a space of ordinary commercial human life that the soldiers could step into and just be people for a while. Fact number 19. All over the world, throughout the war, people made music. Not the broadcast kind, not the official kind, just the music people make for themselves and each other. In British pubs, the piano in the corner got used, and evenings regularly ended with communal singing that pulled in strangers alongside regulars. In American military camps, small informal groups formed around whatever instruments people had managed to get hold of. In Japanese homes, traditional instruments were played in the evenings with the same domestic quietness they'd always provided. And in the ghettos and camps of occupied Europe, people organized orchestras and choral groups and theatrical performances in circumstances that made the existence of these things an almost defiant act. The thread connecting all of this is not complicated. People need to organize their feelings into sound. They need to share that process with others. They need the specific kind of community that music creates, which is different from conversation or companionship because it involves doing something together, synchronizing with another person's rhythm, listening and responding simultaneously. Language can approximate this but can't quite reach it. The war made silence in 1,000 different ways. It closed spaces, separated people, suppressed expression, and everywhere it did this, people quietly opened the silence back up and put music in it. Fact number 20. Across every combatant nation, Sunday mornings seem to have been protected with a determination that surprised researchers looking into the period. Religious attendance in Britain, the United States and Australia increased during the early war years, not dramatically but measurably. Even in secular households, the particular character of Sunday morning, a slightly later start, the newspaper read without rushing, a walk after the meal, a slower conversation, was maintained with what you might call deliberate stubbornness. The Sunday morning was a weekly demonstration that ordinary life still had shape and texture and things worth looking forward to. It was proof of concept, evidence that the life being defended by the war was a life that actually existed in the present tense, not just a memory or an aspiration. There's something quite moving about this when you sit with it. The wartime civilian who protected their Sunday morning, who refused to let the week's accumulated weight colonize those few unhurried hours, wasn't making a political statement. They were just doing what Sunday morning had always been for. Nothing urgent, nothing required. A cup of tea, a bit of reading, the particular quality of a late morning in one's own home on one's own terms, in the middle of a world war that turned out to be worth protecting quite fiercely. Fact number 21. The corner shop during the war years became something it had never quite been before. Not just a place to buy things, but a genuine node of community life. The grocer, the newsagent, the tobacconist. These were the people who knew things about the neighborhood that official channels never had access to, who'd had bad news recently, which family was struggling more than they were letting on, which elderly person hadn't been in for a few days and might need someone to check on them. Every transaction across the counter was wrapped in that local knowledge. The woman buying her weekly ration wasn't just a customer, she was someone whose husband was overseas, whose older child had just been evacuated, who was managing but only just. The shopkeeper knew this. The brief exchange at the counter carried the weight of it, often without anything being explicitly said. Social historians who studied wartime community life in British cities kept finding the local shopkeeper at the center of informal social networks that were doing the work of welfare, connecting people to information and support through a system that had no official structure and no official funding. It was just people who knew their neighbors taking care of them in the small ways that were available. The corner shop was the hub of a lot of that, quietly, without anyone particularly planning it that way. Fact number 22. Fishing as a leisure activity, as distinct from fishing to eat, persisted throughout the war years in Britain, America, Canada and Australia with a persistence that's actually quite revealing. The man sitting at the river's edge on a Saturday morning was not being useful. He was not contributing to anything. He was sitting still, watching the water, attending to something that operated entirely on its own schedule and responded to his presence with complete indifference to the national emergency. That uselessness, by any wartime measure of what time should be spent on, was precisely the point. People who fished throughout the war years described the riverbank as one of the few places where the war could be genuinely, legitimately set aside, not by distracting yourself from it, but by directing your attention towards something that required a completely different quality of attention, patient and observational and responsive to this specific stretch of water on this specific morning. The war had nothing to do with whether the fish were biting. It had nothing to do with the light on the water or the sound of the current over the stones. The Ministry of Information in Britain was apparently aware enough of this psychological function that it made no effort to discourage leisure fishing during the war. Some things were worth preserving not because they helped win the war, but because they preserved something in the people who needed to be able to win it. Fact number 23. Birthdays during the war were treated with a care and intentionality that they don't always receive in ordinary times. Wartime birthday accounts turn up in diaries and letters and oral histories with a detail and a warmth that suggests people understood, at least half-consciously, that the completion of another year of life was worth marking more deliberately when life's continuation wasn't something you could take for granted. Mothers saved up ration points for weeks in advance to have what they needed for a birthday cake. Soldiers received packages from home that had been carefully assembled and sent off early enough to account for military postal delays, sometimes still arriving late, sometimes arriving a bit battered, but arriving. Birthday cards were written with an attention to the particular circumstances of the person receiving them that ordinary birthday cards rarely require. Children's birthdays were protected with special determination. Parents who hadn't fully articulated why they were doing it understood something about it intuitively. The birthday was an occasion that said to a child, "The world can arrange itself around your happiness, not always, not for long, but today, for this." And that message given to a child in the middle of a war was an investment in their sense of the world as a place still worth inhabiting fully. Fact number 24. The morning newspaper remained a daily ritual for millions of people throughout the war, and what it provided went some way beyond the news itself. The physical act of unfolding the paper, moving through the sections in the order you always moved through them, settling into the crossword or checking the sports results alongside the war reports, was a way of saying that the day was starting in the usual way, that the ordinary architecture of a morning was still in place. The crossword in particular deserves a mention here. The Times crossword in Britain, the New York Times crossword in America. These were being completed by millions of wartime readers with a focus and satisfaction that had nothing to do with the war and everything to do with the simple human pleasure of a well-defined problem yielding to sustained attention. During the war, the demand for crossword puzzles increased measurably. More entries to competitions, more requests for published solutions, more letters, as though people had identified the crossword as one of the more reliable small satisfactions available to them. A grid that could be completed, a problem with an answer, a 10-minute window of clean, solvable, self-contained challenge in a world where most of the significant problems were none of those things. The pen was set down. The grid was filled. Something at least had been resolved. Fact number 25. The dance hall during the war was not a frivolous thing. It was genuinely important, in a way that takes a moment to appreciate properly. The big venues in Britain, the Hammersmith Palais, the Locarno in Streatham, the Ritz in Manchester, kept operating throughout the war. They were full, often more full than they'd been before the war. The music was Glenn Miller in America, Joe Loss and Geraldo in Britain, and it provided the backdrop to something that a lot of young people had very little of, a warm, lit, beautiful-sounding space where you could be physically present with other people, move to music and feel, just for an evening, unconcerned. People who danced during the war years and talked about it later consistently described a specific quality to those evenings that the pre-war dance hall hadn't quite had. The knowledge that a partner might be gone within weeks gave everything a slightly heightened quality. The pleasure was real, and the music was good, and both of those things were also slightly bittersweet, because everyone in the room understood on some level that this particular evening might be one of the last ones for a while, or forever. That knowledge didn't ruin the dancing. If anything, it made people show up to it more fully. Fact number 26. Throughout the entire war, in Britain, America, Germany, Japan, and occupied Europe, people kept doing their laundry. This sounds almost comically obvious. Of course they did, but the washing line as a feature of the wartime landscape is actually worth pausing on for a moment. because what it represented, visible above bombed streets and beside damaged buildings and across rubble-cleared spaces, was one of the most straightforward imaginable expressions of a household continuing to function. The domestic labor involved fell almost entirely on women, as it had always fallen on women, and was now added on top of everything else those women were carrying. But the shirts still needed washing, the sheets still needed to be clean, and so they were washed, and they were hung out, and they dried in whatever weather the day provided, flapping in the wind with what can only be described as complete indifference to the situation. Several wartime photographers noticed this and documented it. The row of clean laundry above a bombed terrace, the white sheets drying against a sky that still had smoke in it. What they were photographing, without necessarily having a theory about it, was the most immediate and material form of ordinary life saying, "We are still here, we are still caring for ourselves, we are still doing what households do." Fact number 27. The Sunday walk after lunch had been a British institution since the Victorian era, a slightly formal, slightly ritual stroll through park or countryside or neighborhood, and it continued throughout the war years with a stubbornness that the altered landscape didn't entirely defeat. Parks that had been partially converted to allotments and gun emplacements still had their paths. Damaged streets could be navigated around, the countryside was still accessible on foot, and so people walked with their dogs and their children and in pairs and alone through the particular landscape of a British Sunday afternoon, paying attention to things in a way that the wartime context had made more vivid. There's a quality that walking produces in thought, unhurried and associative, responsive to what your eyes are meeting rather than to anything you've planned. And that quality was genuinely valuable in a time when minds were almost constantly being pulled toward anxieties that couldn't be resolved by thinking harder about them. Diarists who wrote about their wartime Sunday walks often described a heightened noticing, a sharpness in how they attended to the colors of a field or the sound of a specific bird. The landscape was the same landscape, but the walker had been changed by months of living in uncertainty, and the change had finally made the ordinary world visible in a way that comfort and habit had kept it hidden before. Fact number 28. In wartime Tokyo, even as the city came under increasing threat from American air raids, people kept going to the Sento. The Sento, the public bathhouse, wasn't just a facility for getting clean. It was a social institution at the center of neighborhood life in a way that the Western concept of a bathroom doesn't quite capture. The shared bathing space created a specific kind of intimacy and ease that was different from any other social setting. Conversations happened there that wouldn't happen elsewhere. Neighborhood information circulated. People let their guard down in a way that the wartime culture of official stoicism made difficult in most other contexts. When American firebombing intensified in early 1945 and destroyed large numbers of Sentos across Tokyo, the survivors' accounts consistently described the loss of the bathhouse as its own specific grief, separate from the other losses the bombing had caused. Not just the building but the community it had held. The conversations, the warmth of the water, the particular quality of social closeness that the shared space had made possible and that the city as it became progressively harder had been relying on more and more. Sometimes what looks like a practical amenity turns out to be something much more fundamental to how a community holds itself together. Fact number 29. Amateur theatre, the Village Drama Society, the Works Theatrical Group, the Regimental Concert Party expanded during the war years, not shrank, expanded. Materials were modest, costumes were borrowed or improvised, sets were whatever could be assembled from what was available, and the talent was whoever was there, which meant the solicitor might end up sharing a stage with the local butcher's assistant and the school teacher, united by the shared project of producing something that people would enjoy. Rehearsals gave people a regular weekly commitment, a reason to be somewhere specific on Tuesday evenings with a defined group of people working toward a specific goal. That kind of structure is worth more than it seems when the larger structure of daily life has become unpredictable. The performance gave audiences an evening of shared pleasure, and the act of performing, of stepping into a different character and a different story, gave the performers something that the wartime pressure on everyday imagination and spontaneity had made genuinely scarce: a few hours of inventive, playful, unself-conscious freedom. Several people who went on to have post-war careers in the British theatre traced the beginning of it to wartime amateur productions that they'd been pulled into by circumstance and had discovered, somewhat to their own surprise, that they couldn't stop thinking about. Fact number 30. Whatever the wartime kitchen could produce on any given evening, the meal itself still happened. The family still gathered at the table, and that gathering was in its quiet way one of the most important things that happened in a wartime household each day. The recipe books and women's magazines and Ministry of Food pamphlets and personal diaries from this period contain detailed accounts of wartime evening meals that tell you much more than what people were eating. They tell you about the effort that went into the food and the emotions that surrounded it. The cook who had spent time in several different shops assembling ingredients and had managed to produce something that could be eaten with genuine pleasure. The children who needed to be fed enough. The adults performing an adequacy they may or may not have fully felt. And the ritual of the gathered table, the passing of dishes, the exchange of the day's small news that happened around all of it regardless. The meal wasn't just fuel. It was the daily occasion on which the household recognized itself as a household, gathered, together, present, sitting down to whatever was available, and in the act of sitting down together, affirming something that no bomb had managed to destroy, that this was still a family, and this was still their table, and they were still here. Fact number 31. The post office queue in wartime Britain was quietly extraordinary. People queued to send parcels to soldiers, to collect pensions, to buy savings stamps, to send telegrams carrying news that could be devastating or wonderful. The queue itself was just a line of people waiting their turn in a slightly cramped room. But it was also one of the more democratic social spaces of the wartime experience. The social historian Angus Calder identified the wartime queue as a site of what he called democratic intimacy, the ordinary social distances people maintained between themselves in peacetime, the careful non-intrusion, the polite acknowledgement without actual acquaintance, became much harder to sustain when you were waiting in the same line, sharing the same inconveniences, living through the same general situation. People talked to each other, not always, not in every queue, but much more than they would have before the war. People who had lived on the same street for years without knowing each other's first names found themselves having real conversations in post office queues, exchanging news, offering small kindnesses, discovering a shared humanity that the pre-war social geography of their neighborhood had somehow arranged to keep hidden. Many people later identified this as one of the genuinely unexpected positive things the war had produced. Not intended, not organized, just what happens when you put people together and remove the usual social reasons for not talking to each other. Fact number 32. Millions of ordinary people kept diaries during the Second World War. Not because anyone asked them to, but because the impulse to record what was happening around them and inside them was strong enough that they did it anyway, night after night, in whatever time they could find. The Mass Observation Project in Britain recruited hundreds of volunteer diarists and produced an archive of remarkable depth and intimacy. But outside any organized project, across every combatant nation, people were writing. Not about strategies or turning points, about what they ate that day, what the sky looked like, what the neighbor said over the fence, what they noticed on the walk to work. There's something important in that ordinary content. The diary was a way of insisting, in a time when the individual felt very small against the scale of events, that the individual still mattered, that this specific day with its specific texture and its specific small happenings was worth recording, that what one person noticed and thought and felt was worth the trouble of writing down. It was at some level a form of self-preservation, not of the body which the war was threatening in various ways, but of the self, the private, particular, irreplaceable self, continuing to attend to its own life, continuing to find it worth documenting. Fact number 33. Wartime cities sounded different. Their inhabitants noticed this and wrote about it with a precision that tells you how closely the wartime context had sharpened their attention. London during the Blitz had its extraordinary sounds, the anti-aircraft guns, the drone of aircraft, the explosions, the sirens, but it also had its ordinary sounds, the birds at dawn, the children calling to each other in the street, the milk float in the early morning, the piano from an open window on a warm evening. Both kinds of sounds occupied the same air at the same time. What's striking in the wartime diaries and letters is how people wrote about the ordinary sounds when they broke through. A blackbird singing in a damaged garden, a child laughing somewhere nearby, the specific domestic sound of someone preparing a meal behind a closed door. These sounds produced moments of something close to painful gratitude, a quality of noticing that in peacetime those sounds had never required. The ordinary acoustic life of the city, which had been so constant and so background as to be essentially invisible, had become, against the possibility of its absence, audible in a way it had never been before. What you hear most clearly is often what you stand to lose, and what the wartime civilian heard, in a blackbird singing in a bombed garden, was everything the ordinary world had always been worth. Fact number 34. The British workplace tea break. 10 minutes, twice a day, hot tea and whatever conversation happened to be available. This is not the stuff of heroic history, and yet it turns out to have been something worth taking seriously. The Ministry of Labour, which studied productivity in wartime factories in considerable detail, found consistent evidence that the tea break produced measurable improvements in afternoon output. The brief, regularized pause, the mild social interaction, the simple physiological effect of a warm drink, reduced the accumulating fatigue of a long shift in ways that translated into actual numbers. But the factory workers who had those tea breaks could have told you all of that without needing research to confirm it. What they'd have told you, and what the research couldn't quite quantify, was the quality of those 10 minutes, the ease of conversation in a shared pause, the humor that reliably emerged, the kind of humor that comes from shared endurance and mutual recognition, the specific feeling of putting down the work for a moment and just being people together, briefly and simply, before picking it back up. The kettle boiled, the tea was poured, 10 minutes passed, then the shift continued, and those 10 minutes were, in ways that productivity metrics couldn't reach, worth considerably more than they appeared to be. Fact number 35. Rationing did something unexpected to the way people related to food. It made them pay attention to it. Before the war, food was abundant and therefore somewhat invisible. You bought what you needed without particular thought. You cooked the usual things in the usual ways and didn't need to think very hard about any of it. Wartime cooking was completely different. It was organized around scarcity, around substitution, around the daily creative challenge of producing something worth eating from whatever this week's shopping had managed to yield. Women who cooked through the wartime years developed a culinary intelligence that the well-stocked pre-war kitchen had never required, an understanding of why recipes work, rather than just what the recipes say, a confidence in adapting when the specified ingredient wasn't available, a flexibility that came from having no alternative to flexibility. Post-war cookery writers consistently noted this. The wartime trained cook brought a practical competence to the kitchen that had been built week by week in the specific difficulty of getting things right despite having less than any recipe assumed you'd have. And something else. The meal that had required more effort to produce was experienced differently. It was more present, more appreciated, more genuinely tasted. The relationship between effort and value that scarcity had revealed was an embodied understanding that the wartime generation carried with them for the rest of their lives. Fact number 36. Street parties during the war years were modest, homemade affairs, and they mattered more than the sum of their parts. They were organized around whatever occasion the neighborhood could find. A local lad receiving a decoration, a significant Allied victory, someone's birthday, an evacuee coming home. Tables were borrowed, chairs were borrowed, rations were pooled, bunting was assembled from whatever scraps of fabric were available, and a spread was laid out that was unpretentious about what it was. But everyone who contributed knew what the spread had cost, not in money, but in accumulated ration points and effort, and the quiet generosity of sharing something that was already not very much. That shared knowledge gave the food a weight and a meaning that it wouldn't have had in times of plenty. What the street party was really doing was converting a street into something that felt briefly like a shared living room, the physical assembly of a community in its own space, the collective assertion that we are here, we know each other, we are worth celebrating. Post-war sociological studies of wartime street life consistently found that the bonds formed during these gatherings were among the most durable social legacies of the entire period. They lasted long after the specific circumstances that had produced them were gone. Fact number 37. The hot bath. In wartime Britain, the government recommended no more than 5 inches of water. Some households actually stenciled a line at this level in the tub as a patriotic reminder. And yet the hot bath persisted as an object of genuine emotional significance in the domestic life of the period. People described it with a specificity and a warmth in later years that tells you it had occupied a distinct category in the emotional landscape of wartime. Not just a hygienic necessity, a private ritual of recovery. a brief claiming of warmth and solitude and physical ease in conditions that provided all three in very limited quantities. Soldiers returning from active service described the hot bath as the first specific civilian pleasure they anticipated. It represented in the most immediate physical way that you were back in a functioning domestic world. The plumbing worked. The house was warm enough to produce hot water. The door could be closed. The world outside could wait. For 20 minutes you were simply a person in warm water in a private room with nowhere to be. And that, after everything, turned out to be one of the most concisely complete experiences of safety available. Fact number 38. Amateur photography during the war adapted creatively around the restrictions placed on it and continued with what can only be described as enthusiastic stubbornness. Civilians couldn't photograph bomb damage or military installations or anything deemed sensitive, but they could photograph everything else. And they did, with an intentionality that suggests they understood what they were doing as more than just taking pictures. The family photographs from this period, preserved in albums all over the world, show birthday parties and garden teas and children on beaches and couples on Sunday walks. The ordinary occasions of domestic life captured with a care that suggests they were understood as documents, not just as mementos. A record of this being real, of life actually happening to actual people in a way worth preserving. Against the backdrop of a war that was demonstrating in the most direct possible terms how quickly lives could end and records could be lost, the act of photographing an ordinary afternoon had taken on an urgency it hadn't previously carried. Every family photograph taken during the war years was in some sense a small act of saying, "We are here, this is our life, this happened." A contribution to a record that the people making it hoped, and sometimes feared they could not assume, would survive to be looked at in a future that was not yet guaranteed. Fact number 39. The wartime pub quiz, or something very much like it, emerged from the existing habit of informal general knowledge competition that British pub culture had always accommodated. Arguments about cricket statistics, debates about historical facts, the friendly testing of claims against whoever in the room was considered an authority. The wartime context, which had reduced other entertainment options while simultaneously flooding daily life with news and information to discuss, gave this habit an energy and a structure it hadn't always had. Beyond the quiz format, the wartime pub was performing a social function that it hadn't always been asked to perform so urgently. It was a warm lit room, open to anyone who could afford a drink, where you could process the day's news in the company of other people, have your anxieties partially displaced by conversation and mild sociability, and spend an evening not being alone without the formality of a dinner invitation or the expense of the theatre. The beer quality was variable. The room was often crowded, but the pub was reliably there, reliably warm, and reliably full of people who were in a similar situation to you and who were on the whole managing to navigate it. That company, simple and available and asking nothing of you except your presence, was worth a great deal during years when a lot of things that had previously been available had stopped being so. Fact number 40. The vegetable garden produced more than vegetables during the war years. It produced something that several wartime observers identified as a kind of temporal therapy, a way of being in time that the war, with its urgent, unpredictable rhythms, entirely failed to provide anywhere else. Seeds germinated at their own pace. Seedlings needed what they needed in terms of soil and water and light, and no amount of national priority could accelerate or substitute for any of it. The harvest came when the season produced it, not when the strategic situation required it. The gardener who planted peas in March would have peas in June regardless of what had happened at the front in the interim. This simple, reliable relationship between effort and outcome, operating completely outside the war's logic of uncertainty, was genuinely restorative to people whose experience of most other outcomes was one of radical unpredictability. Horticultural therapists working with traumatized veterans in the immediate post-war years drew on this directly, building therapeutic programs around gardening because the combination of physical work, natural timescales, and the dependable reward of growth and harvest produced measurable psychological benefits in people whose relationship with predictability had been severely damaged by what they'd been through. The garden had been doing this throughout the war for anyone who had access to a patch of soil, quietly, without clinical supervision, in the course of an ordinary day. Fact number 41. On the mornings after heavy raids, London transport bus drivers arrived at their depots before dawn and found that their routes had changed overnight. Roads that had existed the previous evening were blocked. The drivers who pulled out into the grey early light were navigating a city that was, in small but significant ways, different from the one they'd driven through the day before. And yet the operational records from London Transport during the Blitz consistently show what can only be described as a remarkable recovery rate. Rerouted services resumed quickly. Drivers and conductors turned up for shifts in conditions that gave them every reasonable excuse not to. And on those same mornings, passengers arrived at their usual stops and waited, standing in streets that were bearing fresh evidence of the previous night, holding their newspapers, checking their watches, queuing in the particular way that London civilians queued, which is to say determinedly and with a slightly pointed air of normality. The bus arrived, they got on, found seats, opened their papers. The city was damaged, the route had changed, and the commute was underway, because the commute was underway every morning. And this morning, amid everything that was demonstrably not ordinary, was not going to be the exception. Fact number 42. The sound of knitting needles in an air raid shelter is an image that appears often enough in wartime accounts to be essentially a fixture of the period. Knitting became, during the war years, simultaneously a patriotic effort, a practical skill, and a meditative practice whose psychological value was widely recognized and actively promoted. The Red Cross calculated by the middle of the war that civilian knitters across Britain, America, Canada, and Australia had contributed tens of millions of garments to Allied forces. Socks, scarves, gloves, sweaters, all produced in the shelter during raids and in the evenings at home and during the long waits between pieces of news. The practical contribution was real, but the psychological function of knitting deserves equal attention. It occupied the hands without consuming the quality of attention that prevents conversation or listening to the radio. It produced a visible, growing, accumulating result, the row-by-row progress of a garment taking shape, that gave time a shape, and provided something that conditions of waiting and uncertainty make very hard to find, evidence that effort leads somewhere, that something is actually being built. Each finished pair of socks represented hours of ordinary time given direction, hours during which the hands were busy and the work was growing and the night, however long, was being measured in completed rows. Fact number 43. In rural Australia, the war arrived not as bombardment or occupation but as a series of quiet absences. Fathers and brothers and neighbours enlisted and were gone. The goods that had always come from overseas gradually disappeared from shop shelves. American soldiers appeared in some towns, bringing a foreignness that country children found simultaneously exciting and faintly bewildering. And the school day continued. The walk along the red dirt road, the lessons in the weatherboard classroom, the lunch in the dusty schoolyard, the walk home in the afternoon heat, but with a different atmosphere than it had carried before. The maps on the classroom walls had acquired new names. Fundraising drives went on. Victory gardens were tended on school grounds. The names of local men were read out at assemblies. The ordinary bones of a country childhood were intact, and the atmosphere around those bones had changed in a way that children could feel before they could understand. What Australian accounts from this period describe is life ordinary in its structure and subtly altered in its meaning. A generation growing up quietly aware that what they were living was contingent on things happening far away. That the paddocks and the schoolyard and the red dirt roads, all of it unremarkable and deeply familiar, depended for its continuity on outcomes being decided somewhere they had never seen and could barely imagine. Fact number 44. Around 1942, darning a sock became a dignified act. Mending had always existed as an occasional domestic task. The war elevated it to something more significant. When clothing became difficult to replace, garments that would previously have been discarded when worn were now darned, patched, taken apart and remade. Shoes were resoled with careful attention to extending their life. Curtains became skirts, blankets became coats. Worn-out sheets were split down the middle and reseamed with the worn edges on the inside, a technique so widely practiced it acquired its own domestic name. The government's Make Do and Mend campaign of 1943 formalized what most households were already doing out of necessity. The pamphlets it produced were received not as instruction in unfamiliar skills, but as official acknowledgement of what necessity had already been teaching for 3 years. Beyond the repaired garments, what mending produced was a particular and sustained attention to things. You couldn't mend a piece of clothing without knowing it quite specifically, its weave and its wear and the particular way it had failed. Ownership became active and knowledgeable in a way that passive ownership never had been. A generation that had mended its way through the war emerged understanding objects differently, with a practical intimacy that the post-war decades of easy replacement would largely and perhaps not entirely beneficially dissolve. Fact number 45. Walking along a canal in Amsterdam in the early years of the German occupation had become something other than an ordinary evening stroll, even though it looked exactly like one. Dutch life had long incorporated the after-dinner walk as a social ritual. The slow movement through familiar streets and alongside the canals was a daily form of decompression and neighborly encounter. Curfews progressively restricted and eventually eliminated this, but in the earlier years of the occupation the walk was maintained in a careful, abbreviated form, conducted with a consciousness of its contingency that transformed the experience entirely. Dutch diaries from 1940 and 1941 describe these restricted walks with an attention to sensory detail that reads less like the record of an evening stroll and more like the record of someone saying a slow and deliberate goodbye to something beloved. The specific smell of water and stone, the quality of autumn dusk over rooftops, the way a particular bridge felt underfoot. By 1942 the curfews had largely made the walks impossible. Their absence in later occupation diaries is mourned in a way that's quite specific, not as a loss of exercise or fresh air, but as the loss of a particular form of daily freedom, the right to move through your own city at your own pace for no reason except the simple pleasure of doing so. That right, once removed, turned out to have been one of the more fundamental ones. Fact number 46. Nobody planned the wartime factory canteen to be a site of social transformation. It was a practical solution to a practical problem. Workers were doing long shifts and couldn't easily get home for meals, so you needed somewhere for them to eat. But what the shared canteen produced, consistently and across British and American and Soviet factories, was a mixing that the physical layout of the factory itself didn't create. Workers from different departments, different production lines, different backgrounds, all eating the same food at the same long tables at the same times. The democratic quality of that shared meal, everyone getting the same thing, nobody eating better, was something that went beyond its nutritional function. Industrial sociologists who studied wartime factory communities found it in the numbers. The canteen produced measurable increases in workforce cohesion, a sense of common membership, of being part of the same enterprise that the divided specializations of the production line couldn't generate on its own. The food itself was modest. Simple soups and stews and bread, assembled within the constraints of rationing by people doing their best. But the thing that happened around the food, the casual conversation, the shared table, the brief daily moment of simply being people eating together rather than workers performing specified functions, built something real. Several post-war workplace welfare provisions in British industry grew directly from the wartime discovery of what eating together was capable of producing. Fact number 47. Before the war, British families took the seaside for granted. Of course they did. It had always been there. You saved up during the year and you went, and the beach was there, and the pier was there, and the fish and chips were there, and it was reliable and known and essentially permanent. By the summer of 1940, significant stretches of coastline had been closed, mined, barbed wired, and absorbed into the coastal defense network. Piers had been partially demolished. The sands at Ramsgate, the promenade at Brighton, places that working-class families had saved all year to visit for one precious week, had been turned into a front line. Some coastal towns kept a reduced holiday function going, and the accounts of families who managed to spend a few days there in this diminished form are genuinely touching. The walk along the part of the promenade that wasn't restricted, the fish and chips eaten on a bench away from the wire, the salt air, which at least was still entirely free. What had been ordinary was now precious, and the people pursuing what remained of it understood exactly why. The seaside hadn't changed, they had. The war had finally told them what a bank holiday by the sea had always actually been worth, which was rather more than the price of the train ticket and the bucket and spade. Fact number 48. Nobody in blacked-out London expected to be stopped in the street by the sight of the Milky Way, but the blackout had removed something from the urban night that had been absent so long that most city dwellers had forgotten it was ever there. Electric light had been obscuring the stars for decades, and then one September the lights went out, and the sky came back. Amateur astronomy appears in wartime civilian accounts more than you might expect. People who had never given the sky particular attention found themselves standing in blacked-out streets looking upward with genuine surprise. Stars of a density and brightness that the city hadn't seen within living memory. Planets visible over rooftops in central London. The moon, which had always mattered to farmers and to sailors, mattering now to ordinary city people who were suddenly aware that its phases determined the conditions under which bombers would fly. Several wartime diarists describe this discovery of the night sky with a quality of wonder that sits oddly and movingly alongside the other entries around it. The raid the night before, the worry about rations, and then, looked up last night and saw more stars than I knew existed, as though the darkness that the war had imposed had given back, purely as an incidental and unintended consequence, a sky that the city had been hiding for generations. Fact number 49. Rationing made cooking harder. It also, somewhat unexpectedly, made cooking more interesting. Before the war, the kitchen ran on habit and abundance. The same dishes, the same ingredients, the same reliable routine week after week. Wartime cooking was organized entirely differently. It was improvised, it was creative out of necessity. It worked around what was available this week rather than what any recipe specified. Women who cooked through the war years came out the other side with something that the pre-war kitchen hadn't required them to develop, a genuine understanding of food, not just recipes but principles. Why something works, so you can adapt it when the specified ingredient isn't available. How flavor actually works, so you can find it by other means when the usual route is closed. A confidence in the kitchen that came directly from having had to figure things out rather than just follow instructions. Post-war cookery writers noticed this consistently. A wartime trained cook brought a flexibility and a practical intelligence to cooking that the pre-war cook, working from fully stocked shelves, had never needed to develop, and there was something more personal in it too. The meal that cost more effort to produce arrived at the table differently. It was tasted more carefully, noticed more completely, appreciated more genuinely. Scarcity turned out to be a surprisingly effective teacher of attention. Fact number 50. Books were in short supply throughout the war. Paper was rationed, print runs were cut, new titles were harder to obtain. And yet by every available measure, books were being read during the Second World War with an intensity and a breadth that significantly exceeded their peacetime equivalent. Library waiting lists for titles that before the war would have sat unrequested on shelves. Informal circulation networks between friends and neighbors sharing the books they had. A demand that consistently exceeded supply across the entire conflict. The accounts of wartime reading describe a quality of absorption that people often specifically identified as shaped by the wartime context. The novel was offering something that was genuinely hard to find in ordinary wartime experience. A world with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Characters whose inner lives were accessible. A narrative that moved according to its own internal logic rather than the unpredictable logic of events. To disappear into a book for an evening was to briefly recover a form of inner freedom that the sustained collective effort of wartime life had quietly but significantly curtailed. The individual mind following its own path through someone else's story, in its own time, without the demands of the collective pressing on it. The gratitude people felt for this, documented in diary entries and letters and in the simple fact of borrowing lists, says something about what the war asked of people and what a good book was able, in the right moment, to restore. Fact number 51. Somewhere between managing genuine hardship and carrying genuine grief, wartime civilians found space for humor, quite a lot of it. In Britain, BBC comedy programs reached audiences in the tens of millions. It's That Man Again, with Tommy Handley, was listened to by what seems in retrospect like essentially the entire country. It generated a shared comic vocabulary that cut across class and region and gave people a weekly appointment with laughter that functioned as something more than entertainment. What made the jokes work was that they were drawn directly from the texture of wartime daily life. The pompous officials, the bureaucratic absurdity, the cheerful resourcefulness of ordinary people navigating impossible regulations, the gap between official optimism and daily reality. Everyone recognized what was being described because everyone was living through it, and finding it funny was not a way of pretending it wasn't difficult. It was a way of maintaining a clear-eyed relationship with the difficulty, seeing it for what it was, including the ridiculous parts, and deciding that the ridiculous parts were going to be laughed at. Research in crisis psychology has consistently found that humor directed at the specific content of shared difficulties is one of the most effective mechanisms for maintaining both individual resilience and social cohesion. The wartime BBC arrived at this conclusion without needing the research, simply by watching what made people laugh and producing more of it. Fact number 52. During the war years, the cobbler and the tailor and the watchmaker became central figures in their communities in a way they hadn't been before the war made their skills essential rather than merely convenient. In small towns across Britain, the cobbler's workshop was a gathering place as much as a service point. You brought your shoes for resoling and you heard the neighborhood news and had a conversation that was as easy as conversations get, because the craftsman's hands were occupied and there was no requirement for either party to be doing anything except being present. The watchmaker who kept your clock running for another year was providing something that went beyond the practical function of a working timepiece. The familiar clock on the mantelpiece, wound each Sunday evening, was a small anchor of domestic continuity in conditions that had made continuity feel precarious. What the repair economy of the wartime years built, beyond all the repaired objects, was a set of social relationships organized around skill and exchange and mutual dependency. People who lived within that economy remembered it in later life with an affection that was about more than economics. It was about a quality of community life that the post-war consumer economy, with its easy access to new things, would progressively replace. Those who had experienced the repair economy understood that something had been lost in that replacement, even if it was hard to say precisely what. Fact number 53. Drawing and painting as private activities, done for no audience and with no professional intention, flourished during the war years in ways that official art programs only partially explain. Soldiers kept sketchbooks. Civilians drew the bombed and altered landscapes of their neighborhoods with the combined impulse of a person who wants to record what they're seeing and a person who wants to understand it by looking at it carefully enough to render it. Children drew what they saw with the unself-conscious directness that children bring to visual expression before adult self-consciousness intervenes. The resulting body of amateur wartime art, enormous and largely uncatalogued, scattered across private collections and family archives and attic boxes, contains some of the most immediate visual records of ordinary wartime experience that exist. What's striking about this work is its subject matter, not the dramatic events but the ordinary ones. A street corner, a shelter, a garden in spring, a child asleep on a bunk. The act of drawing required looking, really looking, with the sustained and particular attention that you have to give something in order to make even a rough likeness of it. And in a time when anxiety was constantly pulling the mind toward things it couldn't see or control, that discipline of looking at what was actually in front of you, here, now, in this specific moment, was its own form of groundedness. Fact number 54. The walk to work in the dark, before dawn, through a blacked-out street, in the cold. Millions of wartime workers made this walk 6 days a week. It was uncomfortable, and it was dark, and there was nothing glamorous about it whatsoever. And yet these pre-dawn walks turn up in wartime diaries and oral histories with a vividness and a specificity that suggests they were carrying something beyond their simple function as a way of getting from a house to a factory. Women working the early shift at munitions factories describe these walks with a sensory precision, the sound of their own footsteps in the particular quiet of a city not yet fully awake, the way the sky looked lightening behind the rooftops, the cold, the darkness, the specific solitude of moving through a familiar landscape in the early morning with your own thoughts. The walk was 10 minutes between a terraced house and a factory gate, repeated 6 days a week for years. And what it provided, for those 10 minutes, was something that the shift and the household and the general wartime pressure on every available hour had made genuinely scarce, unstructured private time. Moving through a known place in the early dark, unhurried, with no one requiring anything of you for these few minutes before the day began. That kind of time is easier to undervalue than to fully account for its absence. Fact number 55. The war created conditions that broke down the carefully maintained social distances between neighbors in ways that nothing before had quite managed. Before the war, people in British terraced streets and American city blocks and European apartment buildings had often lived in close physical proximity for years without knowing much about the people on the other side of the wall. The elaborate social non-intrusion of peacetime neighborliness kept people polite and essentially separate. Shared air raid shelters changed that fairly directly. You cannot spend night after night sheltering with someone without learning their name, their circumstances, their particular way of managing the situation. You cannot share a rationing tip or a recipe substitution or the news of a mutual acquaintance's son without actual exchange happening. The war created countless situations in which the social permission to talk to the people around you was suddenly and unambiguously present. Social surveys conducted after the war consistently found evidence of wartime formed neighborly bonds that crossed class lines and social divisions in ways that the pre-war geography of those same streets had never permitted. The bonds weren't universal. Stress also produces conflict and resentment, and those were present too. But the extent and durability of the social connections formed through the shared ordinary day of wartime surprised researchers who had expected stress to fragment communities rather than, as often happened, to knit them together. Fact number 56. Collecting things was very popular during the war years. Children in particular pursued it with vigor. Stamps, cigarette cards, newspaper cuttings, pressed flowers, and with particular enthusiasm pieces of shrapnel recovered from bombed streets. The shrapnel collections were sorted and categorized with the same systematic seriousness that pre-war children had brought to cigarette cards, which tells you something interesting about the human need to organize the world into manageable categories regardless of the nature of the available material. Collections provided order, a system with known rules, in which things had defined places and defined values, in which completeness was a concept that made sense and could be worked toward. In a broader world where order was in conspicuously short supply, the collection was a self-generated island of it, controllable in a way that almost nothing else was, responsive to effort and attention in a way that the larger situation simply wasn't. Stamp collecting in particular expanded significantly during the war years in both Britain and America. Membership in philatelic societies increased. Sales of albums and catalogs rose against the general trend of reduced consumer spending. People were apparently finding, in the careful organization of small printed squares, something that scratched an itch the wartime world had otherwise left unscratched. The pleasure of the missing piece found. The satisfaction of the set, one item more complete than it was yesterday. Small, quiet, entirely within one's own control. Fact number 57. Tea was rationed in Britain from July 1940 at 2 ounces per person per week. This is not very much tea. And yet the cup of tea remained, throughout the war years, one of the central rituals of British domestic life, maintained with a seriousness of purpose that the modest quantity of available tea required and the importance of what the ritual meant fully justified. The management of the tea ration was a small daily discipline: how to store it, how carefully to measure it, when it was acceptable to reuse leaves, how to stretch the allocation through the week without running out too early. But the ritual the tea was rationed to support was non-negotiable. The mid-morning break, the afternoon respite, the evening settling, each marked by the cup, which was warm and familiar and predictable in a way that very little else was. Offering tea to a visitor was a gesture that rationing had made genuinely costly and therefore genuinely meaningful. Both parties understood that the hospitality being offered had a specific material cost, and that the offer was being made anyway. The social weight of wartime tea, the generosity it expressed, the community it enacted, the specific comfort of a warm cup in cold and uncertain circumstances, was one of those things that several wartime observers wrote about with a precision that suggests they knew they were watching something worth recording. Ordinary life, in its smallest register, insisting on continuing. Fact number 58. In the French countryside in the spring of 1943, a farmer's wife was teaching her daughter to make cheese the way her own mother had taught her. Same equipment, same sequence, same specific knowledge of temperature and timing and the behavior of their particular animal's milk at that time of year. This happened everywhere, throughout the war. The transmission of practical knowledge across generations continued in kitchens and workshops and gardens, passing from the generation that had it to the generation that needed it, in the ordinary course of people living and working together. Nobody organized this. There was no program for it. It was just what happened when an older person had knowledge and a younger person was present and watching. But its cumulative effect was significant. Food traditions, craft techniques, horticultural knowledge, domestic practices built up over generations and refined through accumulated experience, all of this was carried through the disruption of the war years, not in archives or official curricula, but in the daily, unremarkable act of one person showing another how something was done, and the other person watching and learning and eventually doing it themselves, and one day showing someone else. the chain of transmission intact because people were still living together and the knowledge was still needed and the teaching was simply what happened next. Fact number 59. A deck of cards was one of the most traveled objects of the Second World War. It turned up in essentially every context in which human beings found themselves waiting, which during a war is most contexts. The shelter, the troop ship, the hospital ward, the prisoner of war camp, the long convoy crossing. Cards took up almost no space, required nothing except a flat surface and some light, worked for anywhere from 2 to a dozen players, and produced the kind of engaged, sociable, competitive focus that makes time pass without requiring the sustained serious attention that more demanding activities need. Bridge in London drawing rooms during the Blitz, players heading for the cellar between hands when the raid intensified and returning to the table when it eased. Poker in American military camps, easy and informal, just a deck and willing players. Patience played by individuals in conditions where company wasn't available. The specific satisfaction of a logical system working its way toward resolution. Card games in wartime have been consistently underestimated as a feature of the period, but the frequency with which specific games and specific opponents and specific hands are recalled in wartime personal accounts, sometimes across decades, suggests that the hours spent at a card table were among the more reliably pleasant of the entire period. Social enough to be company, undemanding enough to be rest, a combination that was harder to find than it sounds. Fact number 60. Late at night, after the blackout curtains were drawn and the shelter bags were packed by the door and the family had settled into whatever the night would bring, blacked-out cities produced a quality of quiet that survivors describe with a specificity suggesting it was genuinely unlike any silence they'd encountered before or since. Not countryside quiet, which is full of its own sounds. Urban quiet, a city that had not gone to sleep but had gone dark. The usual acoustic texture of an inhabited city, its traffic and its light and its ambient human noise, was gone, but the city itself remained, and what you heard in its absence was what the city had always contained beneath the noise. Dogs somewhere in the distance, a train on some essential wartime journey, the footsteps of an air raid warden on his round, the specific sound of boots on pavement in an empty street, and above it, if the night was clear, the stars. The accounts of this wartime quiet are almost uniformly ambivalent. It was eerie. It was also, in a way that nobody had expected, beautiful. The most profound silence that many city dwellers had ever experienced. The darkness was dangerous and the silence was the silence of a threatened world. And it was also, undeniably, the most complete restoration of natural night that the city had known in living memory. Both things were true at once, and the people lying awake in it, listening, noticed both. Fact number 61. Baking bread at home found a quiet revival during the war years in households across Britain, America, and occupied Europe where commercial bread was either unavailable or inadequate. The process was slow and sensory and required something that wartime life very rarely provided: unhurried, attentive, responsive engagement with something immediate and physical. Dough has its own behavior. It changes with temperature and humidity and the specific conditions of your particular kitchen. You have to pay attention to what's actually happening rather than following the recipe on autopilot. Women who learned to bake bread during the war years consistently describe the experience in terms that go well beyond practicality. The specific warmth of the kitchen while the dough was proving, the smell of yeast, the resistance of dough under the hands, giving way slowly in a way that's distinctly satisfying. The transformation the oven produced, turning something soft and provisional into something solid and fragrant and genuinely nourishing. Several oral histories from this period describe bread baking as one of the activities that most reliably produced a sense of competence and calm in conditions that were organized to produce neither. You had done something real, with your own hands, from basic ingredients, and it had worked. In a world where so much was beyond individual control, the loaf that came out right carried a satisfaction that was entirely and straightforwardly earned. Fact number 62. Checking on a sick neighbor, sitting with an elderly relative for an hour, taking a pot of something to the family down the road who'd had bad news. These acts, small and domestic and leaving essentially no official record, were performed throughout the war years with a consistency and a warmth that social historians have come to regard as one of the most significant features of wartime civilian life. Official welfare provision was stretched beyond its capacity. Formal social services were operating under impossible pressure. and the gap between what the state could provide and what people actually needed was filled, day by day and house by house, by the straightforward human impulse to notice that someone nearby was not managing and to do something practical about it. The act was not dramatic. A cup of tea carried across the road, a pot of soup left on a step, an hour of company offered to someone who had been alone too long. Nothing that would appear in any history, nothing that anyone was commended for. But these acts were among the most important things that happened in the daily texture of wartime civilian life. The ordinary human response to ordinary human need, conducted without fanfare, without official support, and without interruption, throughout conditions specifically designed to make ordinary human life impossible. The work of care going on underneath everything else, quiet and consistent and real. Fact number 63. In wartime Singapore under Japanese occupation between 1942 and 1945, children of different ethnic backgrounds were living in the same geographic space but in entirely different worlds. Chinese Singaporean children navigated daily life under the specific threat their ethnicity represented to the occupying forces. Malay children occupied a different position, less immediately endangered but profoundly disrupted. European children not yet interned were living a diminished version of a colonial life within a radically altered social landscape. The differences between these childhoods were enormous, but researchers who have studied wartime childhood across different occupied territories have found something consistent across these very different circumstances. Children's capacity for play persisted in conditions that had effectively extinguished comparable capacities in the adults around them. The improvised games in backyards, the friendships formed with the pragmatic flexibility that children naturally bring to social relationship, the absorption in immediate experience that childhood provides almost automatically, as a kind of natural psychological insulation. This wasn't a failure to understand the seriousness of the situation. It was a form of resilience, the ability to be fully present in the immediate and the ordinary, which adults had largely lost access to under the weight of what they knew and what they feared, persisted in children with a tenacity that those who worked with them during the war years found both striking and quietly moving. Fact number 64. On a September afternoon in 1943, a retired Birmingham schoolteacher named Harold Wilkins harvested his allotment and wrote about it in his diary in such specific and loving detail that the entry reads, nearly 80 years later, as a small masterpiece of ordinary life noticed and recorded. He listed what he'd gathered: runner beans, potatoes, a marrow, some late lettuce, a handful of tomatoes from plants he'd grown from seed under a south-facing window. He described the quality of the afternoon light. He mentioned a conversation with the man in the adjacent plot about 2 varieties of potato. He wrote about the particular satisfaction of walking home through streets bearing the marks of recent bombing, carrying a trug full of vegetables from his own garden. There was no literary intention in this. Harold Wilkins was not writing for an audience. He was doing what thousands of other ordinary wartime diarists across every combatant nation were also doing, making a record of the specific, sensory, unheroic texture of an ordinary day. Not because history would find it interesting, though history has, but because the vegetables were real and the afternoon light was real and the conversation about potatoes was completely real. And Harold Wilkins, walking home through the damaged streets of his city, understood without needing to articulate it that the reality of these things was exactly what was worth preserving. Fact number 65. In the middle of wartime newspapers, between the front pages and the sports results, the personal columns kept running with their small compressed human dramas throughout the entire conflict. Births announced, deaths noted, engagements appearing with their conventional phrasing, sometimes with the additional detail that the parties were serving in such and such branch of the armed forces, lost property, services offered, and among the ordinary notices the war's own variations, missing persons appeals, notices seeking information about men whose fate was unknown, announcements of memorial services held in the absence of bodies that hadn't been recovered. Reading these columns now is an experience that collapses the distance between then and now quite suddenly, because the human concerns in those carefully composed small entries, the love, the loss, the practical need, the social obligation, are recognizable in a way that the front-page content, shaped entirely by specific historical circumstances, isn't. People got born and married and lost things and needed things and remembered people throughout the war years. They placed notices in newspapers to mark these events because the events deserved marking and the newspaper was where you marked them. and the newspaper kept running the notices because the births and marriages and deaths and missing persons were real and ongoing and would not wait for the war to end before continuing to happen. Fact number 66. Cycling through a blacked-out city required a specific form of knowledge that peacetime cycling had never demanded. In Britain and occupied Netherlands, bicycles were essential transport throughout the war, their numbers increasing as cars were requisitioned and fuel became unavailable. In the Netherlands, the cultural centrality of the bicycle to Dutch daily life made the German requisitioning of bikes one of the more intimately felt forms of dispossession the occupation produced. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was the way you moved through your own landscape. Its removal changed what the landscape felt like. British cyclists navigating blacked-out streets developed what amounts to a proprioceptive knowledge of their routes, knowing where they were by the texture of the road, the angle of a turn, the feel of a curb edge in the dark. The daily commute in the dark was cold and uncomfortable and required a relationship with a specific route that went considerably deeper than simply knowing the way. There is something quite human about this. The body learning a path so thoroughly that the path becomes knowledge held in the muscles rather than the mind. The city known not by sight but by feel. That kind of intimate familiarity, built by repetition through difficult conditions, is its own form of belonging to a place. Fact number 67. Religious attendance in Britain went up during the war, not dramatically but measurably, and when you look more closely at what this actually meant, the picture is considerably more interesting than a simple story about crisis-producing faith. People were using churches for a wider variety of reasons than purely devotional ones. For some, Sunday morning service was a community gathering in a period when community had acquired a new urgency, a place where known faces assembled regularly, where grief had somewhere to go that wasn't a kitchen table, where the ritual of shared form and shared text provided a continuity that felt anchoring when everything else was in motion. For others, it was the building as much as the service, the physical solidity of a church, its depth of historical time, the specific quality of a space that had been used for this same purpose for centuries, provided something reassuring that was less theological than architectural. This particular stone, these particular walls, have been here for a very long time, and will be here after this too. The wartime church that emerges from these accounts was less a straightforward site of faith than a flexible community institution accommodating an enormous range of human need within the familiar forms of a tradition old enough to have held a great deal of human difficulty before. Fact number 68. On a Saturday morning in the summer of 1941, Women's Institute members in a small Worcestershire village were making jam in the village hall. This is not a sentence that sounds particularly consequential, but the Women's Institute had been organized since its founding around a conviction that the skills and knowledge of ordinary domestic life had real value, and that the communal practices built around those skills constituted a form of cultural wealth worth actively preserving. The war had given that conviction a practical urgency that peacetime had never provided. The British government formalized this in 1940 by commissioning the WWII to run a national network of preservation centers. It was an official acknowledgement of what the organization had been arguing all along, that what rural women knew about producing and preserving food was a form of national resource. The jam the village hall produced was genuinely useful, in measurable nutritional quantities, that the mornings spent making it were valuable in ways that couldn't be measured. The conversation around the preserving pans, the shared skill applied to a common practical purpose, the continuity of practice across all the disruption of everything else, knowledge passing between women who had it and women who were learning it in a village hall on a Saturday morning, just as it had been passing in similar rooms for generations before. Fact number 69. Whatever else the war had taken, it had not taken the conversation over the back fence. The informal information networks of wartime civilian life, conducted primarily by women, primarily in back gardens and across shop counters and in the queues that wartime scarcity had made a daily feature of life, were among the most efficient communication systems of the entire period. Information moved through these networks with a speed and a granularity that official channels couldn't approach. Who'd had a telegram, which shop was expecting a delivery on Thursday, what had happened to the family at the end of the road, who knew someone who could get hold of extra dried egg, the practical detail of daily survival, circulating at ground level through a system that had no official structure and no official funding and worked because people were paying attention to each other. The women who maintained these networks were doing something genuinely important. They were keeping the community informed about itself. making sure that needs were noticed and that the informal social resources of the neighborhood, the spare hour, the borrowed pot, the extra loaf, the cup of tea, were directed where they were most needed. None of this appears in official records, none of it would feature in any account of how the war was won. But in the daily texture of wartime civilian life, the conversation over the back fence was one of the more functional institutions available. It kept people connected to each other, which kept people managing, which, when you trace it back, was how a great deal of it was done. Fact number 70. Reading a bedtime story to a child in an Anderson shelter, by the light of a torch held steady against the vibration of distant explosions, is one of the images that comes up again and again in accounts of wartime domestic life. And it's worth thinking about why parents did this, because the reason is more specific than it might seem. Parents who maintained the routines of childhood during the blitz, the bath, the story, the good night, the predictable sequence of small events that told a child the day was ending safely, were doing something that child development research has since understood quite precisely. The routine itself was the reassurance, not the specific words of the story, not the content of any particular good night, but the fact that the routine was happening at all. The parents demonstrated willingness to proceed as though this mattered, as though the child would wake up tomorrow in a world worth preparing for, as though the ordinary structure of a childhood day was being maintained regardless of the sounds outside. John Bowlby's wartime research, and the research it generated, subsequently confirmed what these parents had understood instinctively. Children who experienced maintained routines in bombed environments showed measurably better psychological outcomes than those whose routines had been disrupted. A bedtime story, read by torchlight in a garden shelter, was doing considerably more than it appeared to be doing, as it always has been. Fact number 71. There are hundreds of wartime diary entries that describe someone pausing to watch the weather, standing at a kitchen window on a February morning, stopping on the way to work to look at the sky, just for a moment, for no practical reason, or rather for a reason that had become entirely practical in a way it hadn't been before. A clear night meant bombers could fly. An overcast sky meant they probably couldn't. The direction and strength of the wind affected both. The temperature affected visibility. The specific meteorological character of any given day or night had acquired a direct bearing on whether the night ahead would be safe or not, and ordinary civilians had absorbed this knowledge until watching the weather was no longer just the habitual glance of someone wondering whether to take an umbrella. It was also, though, something else. Something older and less strategic than that. The weather was there before the war and would be there after it. It ran on its own schedule with complete indifference to human arrangements. To look up at the sky and watch what it was doing was to step briefly outside the specifically human catastrophe of the war and into something larger and more patient than any of it. The clouds moved as they had always moved. The light changed as it had always changed. The weather had no opinion about the war whatsoever, and sometimes that was exactly what was needed. Fact number 72. Writing a letter to someone you loved, when that person was somewhere you couldn't picture and the letter might take weeks to arrive and be read in circumstances you couldn't anticipate, required a quality of care with language that ordinary letter writing had rarely demanded. The letter had to do several things at once. It had to carry your presence across a distance it couldn't close. It had to offer reassurance without being dishonest about it. It needed to be warm enough to actually help and honest enough to be trusted. And it had to be written with the awareness that a censor might read it first, which meant certain things couldn't be said at all, and the things that were said had to carry the weight of the things that couldn't be. What this produced, across millions of wartime letters preserved in archives across the world, was writing of a quality of attentiveness that is frequently remarkable. People who had never thought of themselves as writers found, under the specific pressure of having something real to communicate across a real and dangerous distance, that they were capable of choosing words with care and precision, of saying what needed to be said in the space available, of finding the right specific detail of ordinary daily life that would carry in its specificity everything the larger feelings couldn't be expressed as directly. The wartime letter taught a generation to write with care, because the person reading it needed everything that care could provide. Fact number 73. Autumn in a wartime English village had a texture that several rural diarists captured with enough precision that their accounts remain genuinely readable today. The hedgerows full of blackberries in September, a free food that country children collected in quantities that supplemented household rations with a sweetness the sugar allocation couldn't provide. the church tower against the same sky it had stood against for centuries, the particular bare, exhausted beauty of harvested fields. And among all of this, the evacuee children. Children from Birmingham and Manchester had been arriving in these villages since the beginning of the war. Urban children encountering the natural world on its own terms for what was often the first time, finding it alternately fascinating and alarming. Too quiet, too dark at night, too full of unfamiliar sounds and smells. The local children watched these visitors with a reciprocal curiosity. Neither group had the framework to fully understand the other's world. What emerged from this enforced proximity was a form of mutual education that no curriculum had designed and no teacher had formally planned. Two very different childhoods placed by accident into the same hedgerow-bordered landscape at the same moment in history, learning something about the breadth of ordinary English life through the simple fact of having to share it. The blackberries didn't distinguish, the autumn didn't distinguish, and gradually, as autumn became winter, neither did the children. Fact number 74. Preparing for Christmas during the war years was understood, by the families who did it, as something more than organizing a celebration. It was an assertion, a declaration that the occasions by which ordinary life marks itself as meaningful were worth the effort of maintaining, even when the effort was considerable and the materials were restricted and the circumstances were not what anyone would have chosen. Decorations were made from newspaper and whatever colored materials the children could find. Trees, when obtainable, were decorated with pre-war ornaments stored carefully through the year and supplemented with new handmade things. Gifts were modest, often made rather than bought, and their modesty was understood not as an apology but as a statement of what it had cost to produce them within the constraints of a rationed household. Everyone at the table knew what the meal had cost in accumulated ration points across the preceding weeks. What this produced was a Christmas whose emotional intensity was directly proportional to the effort that had gone into it. The gifts were more meaningful because they had cost more in thought and care than in money. The meal was more appreciated because it had been worked toward deliberately. The gathering was felt more fully because the people around the table understood, in the most immediate possible way, that gatherings were not guaranteed. The ordinary season, made more by the difficulty of getting there. Fact number 75. The blacked-out house on an autumn evening had a specific domestic quality that turns up in wartime accounts from both Britain and Germany, described with a consistency that suggests it was a genuinely universal experience. The blackout curtains drawn against the dark outside created an interior world that was enclosed and warm and specifically itself, a pocket of domestic life sealed against the night. Families gathered, usually in the kitchen because it was warmest and best blacked out, in a physical proximity that the pre-war domestic layout with its multiple rooms and separate activities hadn't required. The radio was on. Mending or reading or conversation happened around it in the particular ease of people who had been given, by external necessity, a legitimate reason to stop moving and simply be present in one place together. Several wartime accounts describe these evenings with a candor that suggests some genuine surprise at their own response. Comfortable, that's the word that comes up. Not despite the constraints of the wartime situation, but in some way that's hard to fully account for because of them. The enforced intimacy of the blacked-out house, the single warm room, the gathered family, the shared radio program, had produced a quality of domestic life that the ordinary freedoms of peacetime, with all their scope for dispersal and distraction, had not always managed to generate. Fact number 76. London children played on bomb sites. This was not because their parents were negligent or because children didn't understand what bomb sites were. It was because children need to play and bomb sites were there, and children are remarkably efficient at converting whatever is available into a play space. Hopscotch grids appeared on pavements in streets where the buildings at one end were gone. Skipping ropes turned in alleys beside absent houses. Games of chase and hide-and-seek were conducted in and around the altered landscape with the creative adaptability of a generation for whom this particular landscape was simply the world as they found it. Child psychologists who observed wartime children were struck, repeatedly, by the quality of the play. It wasn't more anxious than pre-war childhood play. It wasn't less inventive. The capacity for absorbed, imaginative, physical engagement with the immediate environment was intact in these children in conditions that had severely damaged comparable capacities in the adults around them. The street was damaged. The games continued. The children ran and called to each other and argued and made up and ran again in the particular free and total way that children run when they are completely absorbed in something. The play was real. The joy was real. And the bomb site, which was the evidence of something terrible, was also just where they happened to be playing today. Fact number 77. People learned new things during the war years, not always because they were told to, often simply because the circumstances created space and motivation for learning that peacetime, with its full schedule and its comfortable habits, had never quite provided. Evening classes in Britain adapted their offerings, first aid and home nursing and car maintenance for women whose husbands had taken the family's mechanical knowledge away with them, vegetable growing for urban civilians who had acquired allotments without any particular idea of what to do with them, but also languages, history, literature, music. The Workers' Educational Association continued to run classes throughout the war, and they were well attended. People who were later prominent in British academic and professional life traced their intellectual formation to these wartime evening classes, attended in church halls and schoolrooms after long working days. The war had reduced the entertainment options and reduced the social pressure to fill available time with consumption, and what had opened up in the resulting space was time and motivation for the kind of self-development that working life in peacetime had always been too busy, too comfortable, too easily distracted to properly pursue. The war had taken a great deal. It had also, in this small way that nobody had planned, given something back. Fact number 78. People kept tending graves throughout the war. Cemeteries in bombed cities had sustained damage, headstones cracked by blast, paths disrupted, the pastoral quiet of a churchyard occasionally violated by the proximity of destruction, and the visitors came anyway, with their flowers and their quiet and their private conversations with the absent. For many of the people visiting, what they were mourning had no grave nearby to visit. People killed overseas, or in circumstances where no body had been recovered, or in ways so complete that there was nothing to return. And the family plot in the local churchyard served, for these losses too, as a place to stand and be present with an absence that had nowhere else to be physically located. What the grave offered in these circumstances was not proximity to the person mourned, it was proximity to the practice of mourning itself. The ancient and continuously human act of returning to a marked place to acknowledge a loss, conducted in continuity with the generations who had stood in that same churchyard before this war, and the ones before that, for reasons just as private and just as serious and just as finally beyond the reach of any words that had ever been developed to address them. The flowers were placed, the visit was made, the practice continued, as it has always continued, and as it will continue. Fact number 79. An unexpected sunny afternoon during the war years produced something in people that an unexpected sunny afternoon in ordinary times doesn't quite produce. A warm April day, clear blue sky over a city still showing the marks of winter bombing, the specific quality of spring light on familiar streets. People who wrote about these days in their diaries reached for language that went beyond the weather because what they were describing went beyond the weather. The sun was not better than it had been before the war. The spring was not more beautiful, but the people under that sky had been changed by the months preceding it. Their capacity for simple physical pleasure had been sharpened by the general reduction of available pleasures. Their attention to the immediate and sensory had been heightened by the awareness that what was present now was not guaranteed to be present later. Wartime diaries that are otherwise quite restrained in their emotional expression, recording events carefully and without much commentary, will suddenly open up at a description of a sunny afternoon with a warmth and a specificity that suggests genuine surprise at the quality of the pleasure, as though the writer had not expected the sun to feel that good, and wanted to record it because it had, and because they understood that this was both ordinary and, in the circumstances, quietly remarkable. The sun came out. It was warm. For a few hours this was the whole of things. Fact number 80. Preparing a meal from almost nothing and placing it on the table was, quietly, one of the more heroic acts of the wartime period. The woman who had spent time in several different shops, working around what was available, managing the ration book, and assembled from the results something nourishing and warm enough to be worth sitting down to, was doing something that required more than most accounts of wartime life have given her credit for. Not just the practical logistics, though those were genuinely demanding. The sustained willingness to keep doing it, every day, under conditions that provided very little raw material and no guarantee that next week would be easier. The meal that arrived on the table was not remarkable. It was whatever the rationing and the shopping and the available skill had been able to produce. It was warm and it was made with care and it was placed in front of people who needed it. and the family gathered around it and ate together, passing the dishes, exchanging the small events of the day, being present in the specific shared space of the table and the meal. This happened every evening in millions of households for the entire duration of the war. It left almost no official record. It was simply dinner, and it was also, in ways that resist any neat accounting, everything the war was being endured in order to protect. Fact number 81. On a Tuesday morning in October 1942, a woman in Coventry made porridge from the last of the week's oats, sent her 2 children to school, and walked to work at the telephone exchange. The city around her still showed the marks of the November 1940 bombing. Gaps in the terraces, a church tower standing without its church. She had lived with these things for 2 years. They had become, in the way that things do when you see them every single day, simply the view. Her diary entry for that Tuesday mentions 3 things: the porridge, a conversation with a colleague about a film at the local cinema, and the fact that her younger child had that morning finally learned to tie his shoelaces. Nothing about the war, not because the war was absent from her life. It was present in every oat of the porridge and in every gap between the buildings she walked past and in the photograph of her husband on the mantelpiece. But it was Tuesday, the porridge had been made, the children had been sent off, the day was beginning, and in that beginning, ordinary life was simply doing what ordinary life does when it is given any room at all. It was proceeding. Fact number 82. Children adapted to wartime conditions faster than the adults around them expected, and often faster than the adults themselves managed. A boy who had never seen a bombed building in September 1939 was navigating around rubble on his way to school by January 1940 with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who has adjusted to a new feature of a familiar route. Girls who had helped their mothers manage ration books could explain the points system to visitors with the easy confidence that comes from actual familiarity with something. For children young enough to have limited pre-war memories, the wartime world was not a distorted version of a better world they remembered. It was just the world as they found it, the one whose rules and rhythms they were learning as a simple matter of growing up. This did not mean they were unaffected. John Bowlby's research was clear that wartime disruption, especially separation from parents, left real developmental marks. But within the disruption, children were living their lives with the full-bodied engagement that childhood brings to whatever circumstances it finds itself in, making friends, falling out with those friends, developing intense enthusiasms for specific things, asking impossible questions, growing up, through the middle of a world war, doing what children have always done, living completely in the world they actually have. Fact number 83. The public park remained open in most British cities throughout the war, though it looked different from how it had looked before. Allotments where there had been flower beds, missing railings taken for scrap metal, anti-aircraft emplacements where ornamental fountains had been, sections of lawn dug up. The park had been substantially reorganized for wartime purposes, and it was still the park. People came with their dogs, their children, their sandwiches, their books. The park bench was still there, and people sat on it with the unhurried ease of people who have found, in the middle of everything, a few minutes that belong entirely to themselves. Elderly men threw crumbs to birds. Mothers watched their children run on whatever grass remained. Couples walked the paths not saying much because the walking itself was enough. The park did what parks have always done, which is to be a piece of the world that exists at a pace different from the city around it, where the human urgency of everywhere else relaxes slightly, and people move more slowly, and the trees grow at their own rate, entirely indifferent to the situation. The park was diminished by the war. It was still, recognizably and reliably, the park, and it was still doing what it had always done, simply by being there, available, unhurried, open to anyone who needed a few minutes outside. Fact number 84. Mrs. Dale's Diary in Britain, Guiding Light in the United States. Radio drama serials that arrived every day without fail, whose characters became over months and years of listening as familiar as neighbors. The appeal of these programs during the war years is sometimes described as escapism, and there's something in that, but it's not quite the right word, because the characters in these serials weren't living glamorous or exciting lives. They were living recognizably ordinary ones, full of the same domestic concerns and small social difficulties and minor crises of family life that their listeners were managing in their own homes. The appeal wasn't in the contrast with real life, it was in the continuity. Here, every day, without fail, was a story about ordinary people dealing with ordinary things. The continuity of that story, its reliable daily arrival, its unhurried domestic pace, was providing something that the wartime world had made genuinely scarce: the experience of ordinariness as something that continues, that has its own ongoing life, that does not require the exceptional. Listeners wrote to the BBC and to American networks about these characters with a personal investment that surprised the people making the programs. They felt the fictional grief when characters died. They felt genuinely pleased when things went well. The characters were fictional. The investment was entirely real, because what people were investing in through the characters was the idea of ordinary life continuing to be lived, and that was not a small thing. Fact number 85. Saying goodbye on a railway platform was one of the most widely shared experiences of the wartime years, and it had a specific emotional character that distinguished it from any other kind of farewell. The departure time was fixed. Everything that needed to be said had to be said before the whistle blew, and the things that couldn't be said, the full acknowledgement of what this departure might mean, were held instead in the pressure of an embrace and a particular way of holding hands and a look exchanged at the moment of stepping back. Veterans and civilians who described these partings in later years are remarkably consistent about what they remember. Not what was said, but the texture of the moment, the specific weight of another person held for the last time before a train moved, the specific quality of a platform becoming empty. And there was something else in these accounts too, something that sits alongside the grief without contradicting it, the particular intimacy that imminent separation produces, the way the knowledge of goodbye focuses everything onto the person in front of you until the rest of the platform disappears and there is only this person, this moment, this final ordinary space before the extraordinary begins. Whatever that was, it was entirely real, and it was in the strangest way something. Fact number 86. Keeping clean during the war required more effort than it had before the war, and people made that effort. Women found ways around soap shortages and stretched the official ration with homemade alternatives. Men shaved with careful economy, making a blade last considerably longer than peacetime use would have required. Hair was washed less frequently but maintained more deliberately, set with care that compensated for the reduced frequency. The government's recommendation of a 5-inch bath was widely followed and quietly resented, and the deeper bath, taken occasionally as a small private luxury, was one of the more widely confessed small civilian transgressions of the period. What kept all this effort going was something quite specific. Not vanity, not official pressure, though official pressure existed, but the persistent understanding that the person in the mirror was still there and still deserved care. That regardless of what was happening outside, attending to oneself remained an act of self-respect worth making. A clean face on a difficult morning was a quiet declaration. The person behind it was still present, still functioning, still here, in the ordinary sense of being a person who takes care of themselves because they are worth taking care of, in conditions that were consistently trying to make people feel small and contingent and overwhelmed. That small daily declaration was not nothing. Fact number 87. After the household had gone to bed, after the house had gone as quiet as the blackout had made the street outside, some people sat down and wrote, not because anyone had asked them to, not because they intended it for any particular audience, just because the day had been too much or too complicated or too full of things that couldn't be properly received by any of the people in it, and the notebook was available and the lamp was on, and for a little while, this was possible. The wartime diary was a space to be honest in, where the cheerfulness kept up for the children could be set down for a while, where the fear that had been kept carefully out of the voice for the sake of the people around you could sit on the page and just be what it was, where the specific, granular texture of the day, too complicated and too many layered to summarize in conversation, could be recorded in the detail it deserved. Reading these diaries now collapses the distance between then and now with unusual force, because what they record, underneath all the specific wartime circumstances, is simply what it is to be a person trying to live through difficult times, trying to make some kind of sense of things, trying to hold on to what matters, finding in the act of writing it down a form of company that the sleeping house outside the lamplight couldn't provide, reaching towards something like coherence night after night, in the quiet at the end of an ordinary, extraordinary day. Fact number 88. People made jokes about the war. A lot of jokes. This is not a footnote to the story, it's part of the story. The cartoonist Giles in Britain and Bill Mauldin in America were two of the most widely read artists of the entire period. Both built their reputations on the same fundamental insight. But the funniest available material was not something happening elsewhere but the actual, lived absurdity of the wartime situation as ordinary people were experiencing it, and that the people experiencing it were hungry for someone to acknowledge this absurdity openly, in public, in print. Giles drew British civilians navigating the regulations of wartime bureaucracy with weary resourcefulness. Millions of readers recognized what was being described the moment they saw it. Malden drew American infantrymen with mud on their boots and dark humor in their eyes. His readers, many of them the soldiers he was drawing, felt seen in a way that more solemn treatment of the war didn't provide. What both cartoonists understood was that laughter aimed directly at the content of a shared difficulty is a form of solidarity. A way of saying, we can all see exactly what this is, including the ridiculous parts, and we are going to look at the ridiculous parts clearly and laugh at them, because doing so is not the same as giving up. It is in fact one of the more determined ways of not giving up. The joke acknowledged, the laughter connected, and the thing being laughed at least for the duration of the laugh, lost a little of its power. Fact number 89. Library books were returned on time during the war. Not always. Not by everyone, but consistently enough that the circulation systems of public libraries continued to function effectively throughout the conflict. People who walked through damaged streets to return a book on its due date because someone else might be waiting for it were not making a political statement. They were just doing what you do with a library book. You return it, because that's the arrangement, and the arrangement makes sense, and the arrangement is worth honoring. There's something in that which is easy to miss because it's so simple. In conditions that gave civilians every reasonable excuse to let the smaller social contracts slide, enormous numbers of people didn't let them slide. They turned up for their shifts, they followed the regulations, they stood in queues and waited their turn, they paid their fines at the library and returned their books on the due date. These were not dramatic acts. Nobody was commended for returning a library book. But they were acts of maintenance, the quiet daily work of holding the social fabric together through the specific mechanism of behaving as though it still mattered, which it did, which is exactly why it needed holding. Fact number 90. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the people who had lived through it found the ordinary world more disorienting than they had expected. The kettle boiled, and it was just a kettle. The quiet street meant nothing in particular. The newspaper arrived, and wasn't frightening. These completely unremarkable things returned to their proper ordinariness all at once, and the people they returned to found the experience stranger than anyone had told them it would be. Years of heightened attention to the everyday had made the everyday vivid in a way that peace couldn't immediately undo. The returned soldier sitting in his own kitchen on a quiet morning, unable to quite believe in its quietness, was not suffering from anything that needed a clinical name. He was experiencing the specific cost of what he had been through. The legacy of years in which the kettle boiling had meant the house was standing, in which the quiet street had meant the previous night's raid was over, in which every ordinary thing had carried something extra, a freight of significance that peacetime hadn't and didn't. Ordinary life had been earned, and the earning of it had changed the earner, and settling back into it would take time, more time than anyone had warned them about, and for some people considerably more than that. The peace had arrived. Its arrival was good and real and worth everything, and living inside it was going to require learning something new. Fact number 91. Long after the war ended, people who had lived through it kept certain habits that their children found puzzling and their grandchildren found touching. The larder kept fuller than it needed to be, the plate finished without apparent effort or thought, the light switched off when leaving any room, the string saved, the rubber bands collected, the glass jars kept for purposes that never quite materialized, the specific frugality of people for whom waste had been not merely inefficient but genuinely wrong. These habits were not neurotic. They were simply the residue of a period in which the careful management of what you had was the daily expression of belonging to something larger than yourself. The generation that had kept these habits wasn't living in the past, it was living in the present with values formed in a different one. Values about sufficiency and care and the specific importance of not wasting what others had gone without. Their children, who had grown up in the post-war abundance of the 1950s and 60s, didn't always understand these habits. Their grandchildren, encountering them in old age, sometimes found them inexplicable. What they were, stripped back to their core, was the ordinary life of extraordinary times, still present, persisting quietly in the bodies and habits of the people who had learned it, long after the times that had produced it were gone. Fact number 92. At their peak in 1943 and 1944, American Victory Gardens produced roughly 40% of the nation's fresh vegetables. 20 million individual plots, city rooftops, vacant lots, strips of earth beside apartment buildings, parks and railway embankments, wherever soil could be found and permission reasonably assumed. That figure, 40% of fresh vegetables, is genuinely remarkable. It speaks to a scale of civilian participation in food production that the United States had never achieved before and has not achieved since. But what drove it was not only the government's promotional campaign, though that campaign was substantial. It was the more personal and immediate satisfaction of growing food with your own hands in conditions where food mattered. Americans who had never gardened before discovered, in the work of coaxing vegetables from urban soil, something that British allotment holders had been discovering for several years already. But the work was absorbing, the results were satisfying, the outdoor physical activity did something genuinely good, and the small community that formed around shared plots was one of the more pleasant, unexpected consequences of a necessary practical effort. The Victory Garden was promoted officially as a contribution to the war effort. What it actually was, for millions of American civilians, was a daily source of ordinary pleasure in the middle of difficult times, the pleasure of something growing, of soil and work, and the specific, uncomplicated satisfaction of something you planted yourself arriving on your own dinner table. Fact number 93. The small pleasures of wartime carried more weight than small pleasures usually carry. A square of chocolate from the week's 2-ounce ration, saved for a specific occasion and eaten deliberately. A bunch of flowers from the garden put in a jar on the kitchen table. An unexpected free afternoon spent doing nothing of any consequence whatsoever. These things were not better than their peacetime equivalents in any objective sense. The chocolate was the same chocolate, the flowers were the same flowers, but the experience of them was different, richer, more present, more fully received. Because when available pleasures are reduced, the ones that remain are attended to with a care and a deliberateness that abundance never requires. Wartime civilians across every rationed country describe this phenomenon consistently enough that it has to be taken seriously as a genuine feature of the period. The reduction of pleasure intensified the experience of what remained, made it more vivid, more noticed, more complete. The flower in the jar was just a flower. In a room that the war had stripped of several other sources of beauty, it was also everything the room had, and it was enough, and it was really, actually, properly noticed, which is more than most flowers in most rooms in most times can claim. Fact number 94. The village fete continued throughout the war years in rural Britain with a cheerfulness that raises a genuine question about what exactly a village fete is for. The bunting was homemade, the cakes were baked within the constraints of rationing. The competitions were the usual ones, the best marrow, the most accurate estimate of the weight of the jam jar, the hoopla run by the same family who had always run the hoopla. And people came, walking across fields and along lanes on a summer afternoon to spend a few hours in the company of their neighbors around a collection of tables in a field. They didn't come for the stalls, they came for the gathering. The fete was proof of the village, evidence that it existed, that its people knew each other, that the community recognized itself as a community and was prepared to spend an afternoon in each other's company on the basis of that recognition. The war had not ended the village. The fete confirmed this. Every year that the summer came and the tables went out and the bunting went up, there's something worth sitting with in that. A community that keeps gathering is a community that persists. The gathering itself, quite apart from anything produced by it, is an act of persistence. It says, we are still here, we still know each other, we are still worth an afternoon of cake and conversation. The evidence is in the bunting, in the tables, in the fact that everyone showed up. Fact number 95. The wartime generation discovered something about sufficiency that the post-war decades of abundance gradually obscured but never entirely dissolved. People who had managed on less discovered, somewhat to their own surprise, that managing was possible, that a life conducted within tighter constraints was still, genuinely and recognizably, a life. That the things that actually sustain a person, warmth, company, meaningful work, small pleasures, a sense of being part of something, are not the things that economic abundance most efficiently provides. This discovery didn't happen through reflection. It happened in the daily course of getting by with what was available and finding that what was available, carefully managed and genuinely appreciated, was enough to sustain a household, a family, a community, a self. The post-war abundance was welcomed without hesitation. The generation that had been waiting for it embraced it entirely, but they embraced it with an embodied knowledge that the generation coming up after them didn't have, an understanding that the connection between material comfort and human well-being is real but not straightforward, that sufficiency is not the same as deprivation, that what you need and what you have available are not always very far apart if you're paying sufficient attention to both. Fact number 96. Children born during the war years grew up in households where careful management of small resources was simply how things were done. It wasn't austerity as a policy or sacrifice as a virtue. It was just life. These children had no pre-war abundance to compare their circumstances against. No memory of fully stocked shops or casual consumption. What they had was what was there. And what was there was, within the real and serious limits of genuine hardship, often genuinely enough. The oral histories collected from people born between 1939 and 1945 return consistently to the same themes: the warmth of the household, the specific pleasures of particular routines, the allotment, the library book, the radio program, the Sunday walk, the sense of community in the neighborhood, the quality of parental attention that the slower, smaller, more deliberate pace of a rationed household sometimes produced. These are not uncomplicated memories. The absences are present in them, the losses, the anxieties, the specific weight of a childhood lived in a world that was doing something frightening, but they are not simply grim either. They are memories of ordinary childhoods lived in extraordinary times. And the ordinariness, the meals and the games and the bedtime stories and the garden and the Saturday afternoons, is as present in them as the extraordinary, because that, as it turns out, is how it actually was. Fact number 97. Many wartime diaries simply stop. A final entry recording the news of surrender or victory or simply the events of an ordinary day, and then nothing. The diary closed and put away, as if the war had been the reason for keeping it and the war's ending was also the diary's ending. Others continued into peacetime, and what they wrote about in those first post-war months was almost exclusively the ordinary. The garden, the meals, the neighbors, the walks, the small events of daily life settling back into their former shapes, as if the return of ordinary things was itself the most important thing to record after all those years of recording extraordinary ones. One woman in Bristol, whose wartime diary ran through 5 years of raids and rationing and the sustained management of a household under pressure, wrote her final entry in September 1945. She had gone for a walk that afternoon along a road she had known all her life. She described what she saw: the hedges, the quality of autumn light, the smell of the air, with the same careful, specific attention she had brought to recording bombings and food queues and the arrival of news from overseas. The walk was entirely ordinary. She wrote it down anyway, because she had learned in 5 years of finding ordinary things worth writing about in extraordinary times, that the ordinary was worth exactly the same attention, as it had always been. As she now knew, in a way she hadn't known before, it would always be. Fact number 98. At the end of each day the family came together, not always harmoniously. Families under pressure generate friction as reliably as families under any other conditions, and the wartime household was under considerable pressure, tired and worried and managing on less and carrying things that couldn't always be spoken. There were evenings that went wrong. Arguments about nothing, the particular brittleness of people who are doing their best and have been doing their best for a long time and are finding it harder than they expected. But the gathering happened, most evenings reliably, because the day had ended and the household needed to be somewhere, and the place it was at the end of things was together. Years later, people who had been children during the war described these evenings with a warmth that suggests they understood their significance even at the time. Not as something remarkable, but as something that mattered precisely because it was ordinary, the daily proof that the family still existed, that its members still came back to each other at the end of a day that had taken them in different directions and required different things from each of them, that the household, whatever it had been through, was still there, still assembled, still sharing the particular domestic gravity of a room at the end of a day. Nothing was claimed for this. It was simply what happened. And it was in the middle of a world war what a great deal of the endurance was for. Fact number 99. Walking home from a late shift through a blacked-out street in winter, the darkness was complete, the cold was real. The tiredness was the particular deep, honest tiredness of a long shift properly worked, the kind that doesn't prevent thought but strips it of its usual busyness and leaves something quieter underneath. Millions of wartime workers made this walk. It was not remarkable. It was a 10-minute journey between a factory gate and a front door, repeated through months and years, in weather ranging from mild to miserable. And yet these walks appear in wartime personal accounts with a specificity and a warmth that suggests they were carrying something more than their simple function as a way of getting home. The sound of footsteps in an empty street, the sky lightening, or not yet lightening, behind rooftops, the cold air, the specific solitude of moving through a familiar landscape in the dark, heading toward warmth and light, and the particular people waiting there. The great events of the war were elsewhere, on scales too large for direct thought. The walk was exactly the right size. A person, a street, a destination, a few minutes of cold air, and the particular pleasure of a door about to open and a light about to appear. The working day ending the way all working days end, with the going home and the home being there. Fact number 100. Among all the small things that wartime civilians described as unexpectedly precious, one comes up more consistently than any other: an uninterrupted night's sleep. Sirens had made them rare. Raid sounds had broken them. Civil defense duties had scheduled across them. The anxiety that came with the territory had a way of occupying the hours between sleep and waking with a persistence that the busy daytime could suppress and the quiet night could not. So a night that simply passed, from lights out to morning, the household undisturbed, the street outside silent for no threatening reason, the sleep deep and full and complete, was something people wrote about with a gratitude that says everything about how rare it had become. Waking up properly rested, the body actually recovered, the mind clear rather than slightly blurred from another partial night. It meant the night had passed without anything happening. It meant the day could begin from a genuine foundation rather than an insufficient one. It meant that things were, on this specific morning, simply all right. And all right during the war years was not a small thing to be. All right was in fact rather a lot. All right was the whole ordinary world, intact and present, still there when the morning came, still there, still worth getting up for. Fact number 101. What the ordinary days of the Second World War reveal, taken together, is something that the large-scale history of the period doesn't always find room to say: that the people who lived through it were not primarily historical actors. They were people. They woke up in the morning with the specific concerns of specific lives. They made breakfast and worried about their children and their parents and their absent partners. They found things funny and got tired and looked for small pleasures and held on to the ones they found. They kept going, not heroically, not with any particular sense that what they were doing was worth recording, just because keeping going was what the day required, and they were the kind of beings who get up in the morning and keep going. The war was the largest event of the 20th century. The ordinary days lived inside it were the largest part of the war. They were where most of the living happened, and most of the endurance, and most of the small and irreplaceable human things that the war was, in the end, about. The porridge made on a Tuesday morning, the letter written by lamplight, the allotment harvested on a September afternoon, the child put to bed, the radio listened to, the book borrowed and returned, the walk taken, the meal prepared from almost nothing and placed on a table where a family gathered and sat down together. This is what was being protected, not an idea, not a political arrangement, not a geopolitical outcome. This, the specific, warm, utterly ordinary texture of a life being lived by a person who is present in it and grateful for it, even when the gratitude is too deep and too quiet to have a name. There is a kind of history that moves in large shapes, armies and treaties and speeches and turning points and the enormous events that reshape the world in ways you can see from a distance. And then there is the other kind, the kind that moves in the shape of a kettle being filled, a letter being sealed, a garden being tended in the rain, a family settling into a warm room at the end of a day. Both are real, both matter, but it's the second kind that most people actually lived, most of the time. And it's the second kind that is hardest to write about, because it doesn't compress easily into drama or argument or narrative arc. It just continues, day after day, with the patient, unremarkable insistence of ordinary life insisting on being ordinary. What strikes you when you spend time with the personal accounts of people who lived through the Second World War, the diaries and the letters and the oral histories and the late-night notebooks, is how much of what they remember is simply their life. The food, the weather, the neighbors, the small frustrations and the small pleasures, the particular quality of a specific afternoon in a specific season in a specific place. The grand events are in there too, but they appear as interruptions to the ordinary rather than replacements for it. The ordinary was the ground, the war moved across it, and the ground remained. There's something worth sitting with in the image of a wartime family gathered in a kitchen on a winter evening, the blackout curtains drawn, the radio on low, the meal finished, the day done. Nobody is doing anything of historical significance. The children will be put to bed soon. The adults will sit a little longer without saying much, because the day has been long and the quiet room is enough, and neither of them needs it to be anything other than what it is. Outside, the blacked-out city is quiet tonight. No sirens, no raid, just the ordinary darkness of a winter evening in a city that is managing, as cities do, to continue. Inside, the lamp is on, the room is warm, the people in it are together. This was what was worth protecting. This was what people were holding on to and returning to and finding still there, night after night, through all of it. Not an abstraction, not a principle. This, the warm room, the lamp, the people in it, together. Rest now. The ordinary world is still here, and it is as it has always been, worth everything.